Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Today I want to talk about how talking about white privilege is not profound, it's just for profit.
Let's do it.
All right, so there's a growing economy for discussions about white privilege in this country that are employing black and brown intellectuals, whites who profess anti-racism to be the missionaries that save white people's souls. White privilege, or the idea that white individuals are born with unearned benefits and advantage over others, has been making its way all through the public media and the classroom. Now, on the face of it, this seems like a really radical conversation. Black, brown, and white people calling out white liberals and conservatives for their racism, having real conversations. We posted on MSNBC, CNN, or even the Huffington Post. But these conversations about white privilege are not really conversations about race, and they're certainly not about racism. It's a business, and it's a business where blacks market themselves as being racial therapists for white people. Now, see, the first conversations about white privilege were like W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, or George Lips's The Possessive Investment of Whiteness, or even Cheryl Harris's piece, Whiteness is Property. And they came from a black radical intellectual tradition. And what I mean by that, Rob, is that it was race critics, black nationalists, Pan-Africanists that didn't simply believe that whites would donate their power and act against their global racial interests to be good people in the eyes of blacks. These are the same people that they owned and they still imprison, people with no political power whatsoever. So Du Bois and Lipschitz understood that there is an antipathy and a power in being against black people. You get free labor. Now, the people in the academy, I'm always put back to what George Jackson said regarding the illusion of many black academics. They have this romanticization of their power to solve racism. Jackson said that the white race, the economic elites of America, are not going to let themselves be educated out of existence. But today, you sound radical, progressive, and insightful by marketing yourself as a therapist for whites. And you don't have to know anything about the actual conditions, structures, and ills that concretely affect the lives of black people. You can even talk about white privilege and not even know the names of the black thinkers, the literature, the context, or the history that the term comes from, and get acclaim by only citing white celebrities like Peggy McIntosh or Tim Watt. See, it's not genius to say that in an oppressive society there are benefits to being in the superior class instead of the inferior one. That's true in any hierarchy. It's not an aha moment. Being on the top is generally better than being on the bottom. But when you talk about white privilege, that person gets to pretend that America is not really oppressive. They love America. They just want whites to surrender their privilege so we can all be equal. See, the revolutionary doesn't have white friends. The government killed MLK. Assad is called a terrorist. Derek Bell is erased from the field of critical race theory that he helped started because he spoke out about the actual racial, economic tyranny of corporations, governments, the military, and the white public. So to these people, they're criminalized and they're punished. But for the for-profit revolutionary who wants to be commodified by whites, right? They want to be the black friend that cured the white race. While that white racist who's suddenly cured, they get to say, oh, well, this is my friend. They point to that very relationship with the black person as proof that they're now healed. And they get to show off to other whites that they're now the white ally. The conversations about white privilege are simply moral appeals to the consciousness of whites who have already shown themselves to be committed to racism and social inequity. And we hope that we have this idle hope that suddenly those racist whites are just going to suddenly change their minds because we made a moral argument. See, the implication about talking about white privilege suffers from a childlike naivete. It suggests that simply exposing racism and the privilege of whiteness to the white mind motivates whites to no longer act in their own self-interest. It's like the liberal utopia that was born out of integration. There's this unjustifiable assumption that telling whites about their social position means that they're automatically going to surrender their power to appease a pop cultural account of oppression. Think about the dishonesty of this approach. Black people, oppressed people, know that there is a fundamental difference between being oppressed and black and not oppressed, treated like a citizen and white. And then we call for national conversations on race, where these public intellectuals get credit for starting conversations that amount to a little more than allowing white America the opportunity to dismiss and deny any actual realities that black America suffers from. And regardless of the outcome of these conversations, these black intellectuals that champion or expose white privilege come out looking like prophets. See, the issue is racism. The issue is white supremacy. The issue is anti-black death. Try discussing that and see how your oppressor recognizes you then. Now, I remember at a recent APA, I sat down to a feminist of color. I was trying to get her white male student who couldn't get a job in the white figures he studied and wrote a book on a job in race theory and black philosophy. And this professor felt comfortable telling this white male that if you start talking about white privilege, where she claimed the field of Africana philosophy was going, he could easily land a race job. Now think about this. So all the black, brown, and indigenous scholars who study the raw histories of oppression and resistance lose out because they don't want to give white liberals and conservatives a guilt trip. And I think this is a powerful example of how an academic discussion of white privilege distracts the racially oppressed. And it empowers the white oppressor class to be employed in discussing systems they have no real interest in dismantling. It's a dishonest conversation looking to get jobs and a profit off of being recognized by your oppressor. It's not real. Domination's real. Oppression all based on race and white supremacy, that's real. Try having those conversations.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Monday, October 14th, 2013. So I have been told. We will be back. Next scheduled program is Thursday. Might be before then, but we definitely will be in on Thursday. It will be much earlier than our normal evening broadcast time. Our guest will be joining us from Macedonia, World System. Always a hoot to have folks on from different parts of the world. We'll give out more information a little later in the broadcast. I would also encourage listeners, make sure you are checking the news, whether it's reading the newspaper or if you're watching various news channels or if you're listening to news radio programs, be checking out the news. Just saw over the weekend they had a race riot in Russia. Someone was killed. They immediately blamed non-white people, were rioting in the street, had to get hordes of police officers to come in and restore order. They were chanting, this was printed in the paper, they were chanting Russia for Russians and white power. Said that explicitly. They were chanting white power, world system of racism, white supremacy. Our guest for today's broadcast, you heard him at the beginning in the audio clip. Always grand to have non-white people, black people on the program who are a bit less confused about the system of racism, white supremacy, particularly the folks who grasp the deception that is being practiced, skillful use of words, talking about white privilege, not really getting to the root of the problem, particularly when it is coming from the lips of white folks like Dr. Peggy McIntosh, former guest on the program, Timothy Wise, former guest on the program, Jane Elliott, former guest on the program. Folks who talk about this make a lot of money doing so and end up confusing a lot of non-white people. Real pleasure to have him on the program. I think a lot of our listeners are already familiar with a lot of his work. He is an associate professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University. Nationally syndicated radio segment Talking Tough with Tommy, hosted by Rob Redding on SiriusXM. You can hear it. They also have clips on YouTube where you can check it out. If you put his name in on YouTube, you should be able to check it out. His material, it's online, quite a few places. You can go to Racism Review. He has posts written there. He's been interviewed by Forbes.com, Wall Street Journal, Salon.com. Lots of great material online. You can also go to academia.edu, and he has quite a few articles posted there. We're going to try to talk about as many as we can, time permitting today. Real pleasure to have him on the broadcast. Joining us live, our guest for this evening, Dr. Tommy Carey. Let me get his line for us here. Let's see. Oh, got him. He was at the top of the list. First person on the line. Dr. Carey, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Outstanding. Good. So thankful you could share a bit of your Monday evening with us. I know a lot of our listeners are big fans of your work. Real pleasure to talk about something.
Appreciate the invitation.
Outstanding. For some of our folks, this might be their first time hearing from you. Anything that you think would be helpful for them to know about your work and what you do before we proceed?
Yeah, I'm a black philosopher, which means that I'm one of about 160 people in the country that dedicates their career to studying the philosophy and intellectual history of African-descended people. Of that group, I think I'm one of the few that would call themselves are really specialized in critical race theory and anti-colonialism. So my work doesn't pretend that we can have moral discourses with oppressors, specifically the racial caste system that's set up in America and racialized whites, to change the situation of black people in this country. I think one of the mistakes we make when we talk to black intellectuals is that we look to them to give us moral guidance. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think that when we talk about black intellectuals or look towards black intellectuals, we should be looking for systemic analysis, things that move beyond description that try to tell us why systems work. So that's what I'm actually trying to do and what my publications aim to achieve.
Right on, right on. You are a black male, obviously, for folks who have not seen you.
Yes.
Right on. This program, Context of White Supremacy, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism. I use the term racism and white supremacy as synonyms, and I use the same definition for both terms. The definition I use is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think that such a system exists, and do you think that's an accurate definition?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at it in terms of the birth of race and how race coincides with things like imperialism, colonialism, economic exploitation, and how it divides people into owners and laborers, I think that's correct. I don't think that when we talk about racism or white supremacy, I actually think you're very accurate with that. I mean, that's exactly how W.B. Du Bois understood and defined the term, the souls of white folks, in his later work, The World in Africa. So I think that when we talk about white supremacy, we have a tendency to use it as a hashtag. We say white supremacy when we disagree with people or white people do things that don't mesh our politics. But again, if we pull towards systemic analysis and what white supremacy is, you get very close to the definition that you just gave. We're going to talk about systems, economic systems, where colonial empires, where people have defined themselves as white, pretty much believe that they can colonize, exploit, dehumanize non-whites on the basis of economic profit or racial superiority. And I think that one of the mistakes that we make when we have these conversations about race and racism is that we talk about our own political ills. You know, this, as you've heard from some of the talks I've given on Reading News Review, we'll talk about our political ills, what's not happening in the United States, but we don't connect that to larger imperial projects around the world. So we'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement and talk about Martin Luther King, but we don't talk about how King was going to the UN to supplant or try to suppress U.S. imperialism. We don't talk about how the Cold War was integral to getting desegregation in the 1950s, or how the effects of integration by black people becoming America fundamentally takes them away from kind of a pan-African consciousness in terms of their awareness of what's going on in Africa as well as other parts of diaspora. Those types of conversations mean that we become less intelligent people and more ideological every time we embrace a domestic policy that doesn't give us the same economic opportunities as our white counterpart, without looking into how our lifestyles and our aims for political rights in fact exploit or degrade and erase some of the voices of African-descended people throughout the world.
Global context, very important. I want to try to cover as much material as we can.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We focus a lot on words and definitions on this program, and I think you do too. And I think one of the main problems that I've seen, many non-white people, they talk about racism, complain about racism, feel that it is a problem, but they don't really have that deep, as you said, systemic analysis of what that means on a global level, what it means to be a white person in that global system. I wanted you to talk about that in the context of your essay. It's racism as white supremacy. I wanted to read a quick paragraph and then get your thoughts. The paragraph you write: to accurately identify racism as white supremacy, we must start to look deeper for the source of the phenomena popularly considered racist. Racist acts by individuals have to be understood not simply as individual ignorance or the spontaneous appearance of personal bigotry, but as particular instances of whites' part in the larger historical narration of white supremacy, an orientation that continues to define, sustain, and justify judgments about black inferiority, and to bolster individual whites' identity to this very day. Remarking on the expansive scope of whiteness, Du Bois claimed that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever by emphasis and omission to make children believe that every great soul the world ever saw was a white man's soul, that every great thought the world ever knew was a white man's thought, that every great deed the world ever did was a white man's deed, that every great dream the world ever sang was a white man's dream. In fine, that if the world were ever dropped, everything that could not fairly be attributed to white folk, the world would, if anything, be even greater, truer, better than now. Great paragraph. Can you give us a little more detail?
Absolutely. That almost makes me sound like I'm an intelligent writer, huh? I think that when we talk about racism, just as I say in the paragraph, one of the things we do is we focus on interpersonal relationships. And even when we talk about there are systemic issues in how we understand race or racism, most of that is just lip service. I'll give you a great example about this. We'll talk about black people being treated poorly. We'll talk about Trayvon Martin, for instance, right? And we'll say, well, look, this is an example of white racism, and the public support, the way that it's clearly racialized, white people on one side, black people on the other, with little liberal whites blurred in the middle of the mix. We'll say, well, look, this is an example of systemic racism. And then what do? We make criticisms, or we make analyses that want to start interrogating the aspects of the situation. So we'll talk about Trayvon Martin as a black male. Then we'll have reactions about what if he was a black woman, or if he was wearing a hoodie, or any of these other things, right? These conversations, while hypothetical and may be interesting as kind of thought experiments, claim that they're systemic because they're talking about group problems, macro problems, but what they're not doing is understanding that there is a structural reality that affects all black people that's based on the template of how black men especially have been killed by the state. It is a useless conversation to say that we're talking about structural racism and then raise hypotheticals about groupthink or group thoughts about black people. What we have to understand is that structural arguments about racism argue that there is a predetermined destiny for people who are non-white. In other words, we know that when you look at criminal systems, that they're going to incarcerate black people at a higher rate, not simply because that's contingent, but because, as Du Bois says in The Spawn of Slavery, these things are the ways that we continue slavery under another name in a different historical period. See, people don't like to think about the world being predetermined for them. They like this, it's just like religion. They like the idea of free choice. They like freedom of thought. They like to believe they control their destinies. But when you're talking about empire, free choice, individuals controlling their destinies destabilize society. This is one of the reasons the 1960s was such a problem for the United States government. This is why the FBI, the COINTELPRO, the CIA of the world decided that they had to squash that kind of social movement. But we come today and say we want to do structural analysis just talking about groups like groups of white men, groups of white women, liberal whites, as if that's the structural analysis. The structural analysis is implicating the government, the state, the laws, the police force, that specific jury, that jury selection, and saying how is it possible, or how do we know that it's probably likely that given these circumstances they'll achieve the same end? How do governments, how do states, how do police officers manipulate reality and distort facts of the matter so they get the predetermined end? That's what structural racism talks about. How things like courts, how things like universities condition people, use propaganda to inculcate people with the idea that society should maintain and that non-whites end up in the same place that they've historically been. And when we do lip service to these types of ideas saying, oh, we should talk about poverty as a component of racism, oh, we should talk about gender as a component of racism, those kind of analyses, while they're useful in contextual situations, largely miss the predetermined nature of how a society that's based in imperialism and understands itself as an empire is going to put non-white people in relationship to white people.
If I could add to that, I think a lot of the conversation, particularly you were talking about Trayvon Martin, I guess now if we want to update it, Jonathan Ferrell or Miriam, Carey, right. Pick anyone you want. These sorts of incidents, when they happen, I think a lot of it is we are afraid. I do think there's a lot of confusion, absolutely, but I also think there's a great deal of fear in coming out and laying a blanket indictment and saying being white means that you are racist. That's what it means to be white. That's what this system is conditioned to produce. All of the white people, everyone who is classified, accepted as white, that's what it means. You are supposed to be participating in this apparatus, global of dominating, abusing non-white people. It doesn't matter, whatever your field, whatever your expertise, you're supposed to be using that towards maintaining global domination over non-white people. And I think a lot of non-white people are afraid, for a variety of reasons, of making a blanket indictment like that, of upsetting white people or making a statement like that, because we are still subject to them. They sign our paychecks and, pretty much everything else we are dependent upon. I think it's just frightening even to kind of hold that concept that, wow, all of these white people are participating in this system that guarantees that we're going to have Trayvon Martin, guarantees that we're going to have Miriam Carey. Do you think that's accurate?
I do. Again, this is what I was talking about just a second ago in terms of how we don't really like structural analysis, because we like to have freedom of thought and freedom, free will in terms of how we understand the world, right? I mean, look, when we understand racism as a structure of white supremacy, and I want to be very clear about how I'm defining racism. So, going back to Barbara Fields, she wrote this definition I really think captures it. It's that, racism is the idea that you have a racialized group of people that are economically, politically, socially inferior to a superior group, and then you have the power to make that idea a reality. So if you believe that black people are economically, socially, politically inferior to white people, and then you make black people economically, socially, politically inferior to white people in the society that you're in, there you go. You have a racial system. So then what people want to do is they want to kind of absolve people. So they say, okay, even though we know that we live in a society that's structured in this way, surely we can judge white people based on their individual character. If this white person is nice to me, or this white person says they don't have any problems with black people, right, that we can somehow judge them differently than we judge the system. On the one hand, I could understand that in terms of interpersonal relationship, but on the other hand, it's an irresponsible analysis of a society. That if you're going to look at how societies functions in terms of how they have laws, who they elect, who they're represented by, what's their economic situation, etc., then for you to say that we can have individuals that have to participate in all these facets of society, they have to work for somebody, they have to buy a house or rent from someone, right? And those things are going to be largely racialized, because race is going to be a large indicator of class status or opportunity and education, and a whole bunch of other factors that matter in terms of our society. So for you to say that this one individual who's been born with all these privileges, all these advantages in terms of education and class status and opportunity, and even not being policed by the state or surveyed or not having a criminal record, you're going to say, even though they get all these advantages, they're nice to me. That overlooks the reality of what birthed that individual's social existence. On the other hand, when you try to explain black people's social life, or rather our social death as it is, you see that we're affected by all sorts of government surveillance, all sorts of social repression, all sorts of marginalizations, still issues of segregation that affects our health, our education, our ability to socially mobilize through the ranks. All these things affect how we exist as black people in America. Now, that's how the world sees us. And even that white person that's nice to us sees us in that way and sees that their behavior to us is not colorblind, but in fact an act of friendship, of generosity. We say we shouldn't judge them for that. I think that's an intellectually irresponsible way to conduct ourselves in the world. Again, if we're talking about how the United States as an empire structures and organizes society, then we have to look beyond individual interactions and look to what births those social existences. Because our deaths are not caused by people simply mistaking us. Our deaths are caused by a necessity of a system that has to mistake us as inferior, that has to mistake us as criminal, that has to mistake us as being the thing that's undesirable in society. We're what fill up the jails. We are the labor force of America. We're what's exploited. And again, I think this is what happens when we lose the message of the civil rights and we buy the propaganda that many white liberals give us, which is King was there to teach everybody about love, without understanding that King said we should love people, but white people had to fundamentally change, that we cannot coexist in a world where white people believe they're racially superior, because in that world they will use all forms of technology, be it the police, the military, etc., or even capitalism itself, to make sure that we stay at the lowest rungs of society as labor. And we miss that because we want to love our oppressor. We want to have moral conversations with white people and act as if that friendship itself has proved that King's dream has come about, instead of looking at the fact that black people, and specifically black men as an underclass, invalidate King's dream and in many ways turns it into a functional nightmare.
I wanted to speak to, you talk about this in the paragraph that I read. With regards to many of our quote-unquote sick white brothers and sisters, many non-white people, and I've heard a lot of white people say that the problem is that white people are ignorant. the problem, the reason that racism still exists is because they're ignorant. They just don't understand how racism works, how they perpetuate this system, things that they do that they're not even conscious of. This is something that I hear even Jane Elliott, she's coming back next week. She was saying that. She was saying that this is just ignorant. You just have a lot of ignorant white people that are in charge. Do you think the system of white supremacy is the result of white ignorance?
No. I think that it's there's a lot of things we could say about white people throughout history, but one thing about them is that they're not simply ignorant, they're very deliberate. Right, and again, this goes back to how you understand the purpose of empires and what you think that they are. I mean, if you take the view that white ignorance has sustained a system of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, post-integration or post-racialism that now masks, Obama's imperial conquest throughout the world, then that's a very profound ignorance, right? We explain things away by claiming, and again, this is us trying to make a difference. We explain things away on the basis of how we think we can change people, instead of understanding how states and militaries and, empires and imperialism actually function in the world. There's no reason that people are going to let a population that they own come to dominate the world. They're not, or the state for that matter. There is a very real idea in the United States that black people are still inferior. Every time we see people like a Jonathan Ferrell or a Trayvon Martin or a Jordan Davis, right, or even a Chris Dorner, those people become examples of how at no point the oppressed population can or should be, revolutionary or resist the state's power. I mean, we've seen an increase of surveillance. We've seen an increase of militarism. We've seen an increase of violence. So to suggest that these things are based in ignorance without looking at the modernization of all these pieces of society that have been historically used to repress black people and political dissent seems to be a little naive in my book. Right, you don't put people in a society and give them the tools to overthrow the society. That would be silly. So we say that white people are ignorant. That means that white people, in fact, have no idea or have no political consciousness about them being white. And given that they're willing to form things like the Tea Party or move backwards into conservatism and even have liberals increase racism in reaction to how they disagree, it seems silly to suggest that that's just haphazard. And I think that it's much more productive to analyze the ways in which racism and white supremacy are dynamic and continue to adapt to still have the same end. Those kind of explanations always throw me for a loop, because government and politics don't simply work on the basis that it's accidental. And it seems too programmatic for us to say that these are just a whole bunch of ignorant white people that really care about black people or care about immigrants or care about, other non-whites if they knew about it. They can see us. So they deal with us through policy. They deal with us through violence and even implicit bias studies. I mean, Philip Adaba-Goff's piece, Not Yet Human, suggests that these white people have very real implicit biases that reify their cultural patterns, that they see violence against black men and they think apes. Right? That's not accidental. That's a very real historical notion of how they understood African people from the jump. So I think that we have to be very careful when we try to give consciousness or give moral ideology to our oppressors. I don't think that it serves anyone at all, especially not us.
Absolutely. I would add to that when you throw in the global component. Now, that really, in my view, you say the same thing happening in South Africa, England, France. They were just rioting in Sweden earlier this year. That was about racism, white supremacy as well. That's profound that you have a coordinated ignorance among white people globally that has the same.
And think about the program, right? So all these people from Europe just accidentally had the same ideology to colonize the world, and specifically in the United States and South Africa, developed systems based on the same model of racial segregation. That's too coincidental in my book to claim something like ignorance. And then those descendants of those people still maintain racial inferiority based on the segregationist program that they've had in place for decades. And we're just going to say, oops, it's not as if they've been psychologically conditioned to accept the notion of racial superiority. It's just that they're ignorant and they don't know what's going on. I mean, that's silliness, right? Like, nobody would give a sociological analysis that said that even though we just got rid of a program based on segregation and racial superiority, that the people and descendants from that program who grew up with that or seeing it or even are born into it, now they're just ignorant. They're not continuing the legacy of the program they were socialized in. That's just stupid. Right, but again, this is what I'm saying. These are the types of excuses that we give ourselves to believe that we can make a difference and that the world doesn't become fatalistic, right? That there's still some point of living in the world. And I think that when we put that hope, that idle hope out there that we can change things instead of accepting reality, because we think reality is just too brutish, then we get into all these contradictory illusions, right? There's nothing. It may be depressing, it may be extremely pessimistic, but there's nothing wrong with identifying a system as an empire, right? I mean, this is what Du Bois was saying at the end of his life, like in 1962. He was saying, look, I believe the white race is the most dishonest race of all time, within, the birth of history. And I think all history proves that. And that we have to make all white people accountable for racism because it's a global system, right? And we never talk about that part of Du Bois because we want to talk about the Du Bois that gives us some kind of hope, which he abandoned quite early in his life. So when we don't read him past 1920, really, we'll talk about the Soul of White Folk where he gives that quote about whiteness being the ownership of the world forever and ever. But we don't talk about the social diagnoses he gives about how white people control knowledge and how they control history and how they control philosophy and how they manipulate law to make us come up with the idea that we can actually change some things, right? We don't talk about Du Bois being against integration and believing that the Brown v. Board happened purely because of the Cold War. We don't want to mention that, or how we thought that by us integrating, white people would control the minds and political consciousness of our children because now they'll be birthed and taught as if they're Americans versus Africans. You see, people knew about this stuff. This isn't like conspiracy theories. This is what black intellectuals were talking about when the Civil Rights Movement was happening. So that's why Du Bois disagreed with King. But today we come up and we want to reinvent the wheel and pretend that we're back in at the turn of the century saying, oh, if we could just talk to Master the right way, if we could just assimilate, if we could represent ourselves, if we could whistle Vivaldi, that these white people are going to accept us. And even if you get individual white people to accept you, that does not change the way the state, all the machinations of the state, like the police, the courts, etc., are going to interpret black bodies because they are fundamentally geared and fundamentally saturated with anti-black biases. That's just the reality. Now we could keep talking to white people and getting liberal whites on their side, but I think that the products you get there are going to be like, the Tim Wises of the world where we have this situation, where we're asking, well, what is a white ally? And a white ally seems to get paid more than, the black revolutionary because the white ally becomes a spokesperson, at least in the mind of whites, for whole movements, right? Why get into that instead of understanding the systemic character of what generates white people speaking for black people in the first place and why black people are never going to be able to use the university or even the law, as Derek Bell talks about, to fundamentally change the structure of American society.
Again, our guest, Dr. Tommy J. Carey. You walked right into my next question. I think you were talking about some of the myths and fairy tales that we have been conditioned to hold on to. I think one of the most powerful mythologies is the idea, the hope that whites can be redeemed, that somehow we can find 1 or 5 white people that are not racist, or we can somehow rehabilitate them so that they are no longer racist. And I think Timothy Wise, Dr. Peggy McIntosh, this new cohort of anti-racist whites, I think that is a very powerful weapon in the arsenal of white supremacy, because I think they convince a lot of non-white people that, see, you all are wrong. You all are you're being too pessimistic. There are white people who are really trying. They're doing the work. They're writing books. They're giving talks. They're doing everything they possibly can to point out the damage that the system of racism, white supremacy is doing. And we just need to get more of their material out and go to the white privilege conference, and we'll be able to get a significant number of white people to link up with us and solve this problem. I think you've given some great analysis of this, and particularly their use of the term white privilege. Can you talk about how that is not really pushing us towards a solution to this problem? Absolutely.
I'm actually surprised that piece on white privilege caught on the way it did, because, I'm not a big fan of any of this kind of privilege talk, be it white privilege or now this concoction of black male privilege. I think these things are silly. It's, as I said in the piece, if you're in a society that is organized based on racial superiority, then if you're white, you're going to have clear advantages over people who are not white, because being in the white part of society, the white class or the white caste, whichever term you prefer, is going to make you superior. Now, that's going to be you're economically, politically, morally, racially, psychologically, all these things. That you're going to be superior to what you define as a racial inferior, or in many cases in America, the non-human. So when we have a conversation about white privilege, what we what we do in that conversation is generate a moral discourse of recognition. In other words, we tell the white person, you have these privileges, so if you recognize these privileges, that makes you a moral person. Notice, it doesn't mean that you stop acting on those privileges or those advantages, i.e. the economic, political, social, psychological advantages of being a white person, just that you acknowledge them. And once you acknowledge them, despite still living and benefiting from them, you somehow become a possible ally to a black movement. Now, this is why I criticize this whole conversation as bourgeois and illusory, right? Because the people who are actually oppressed don't get to determine or have any input in the recognition from white people. In other words, you could have black academics having conversations with white academics that in the academic space are trying to make sure that nobody appears to be racist or sexist or homophobic or classist, etc. Everybody has to be these pure moral individuals. And then when that person says, look, you have that racial privilege, you got to get rid of that, they confess to you, yes, I have this racial privilege, I'm trying to challenge it, I'm admitting that I'm a racist, now we can be friends and work together in a coalition, right? That's a stupid idea, right? When we talk about white privilege, what we're talking about is the manufacturing of moral white people, of liberal white people that can benefit from utilizing the strategic rhetoric of racial sensitivity. So we're benefiting people by saying, I understand what racism is. Here's what racism is. That white person's a racist. I'm not a racist. I'm an ally. And by giving them that title of ally allows them to work in these areas and work with black people to produce more of this kind of integrationist post-civil rights jargon that says that we should talk, educate, etc., people so that they can get out of racism. The problem with that, it doesn't address structural racism. It assumes that you can educate oppressors out of their racist disposition. So in the piece I mentioned George Jackson. George Jackson said that white people, the bourgeois, the elite racial class, is not going to educate themselves out of existence. I'm not going to own the law. I'm not going to own the military. I'm not going to own the government and let something as silly as a book somehow change my moral characterization of the world, because one is based on the idea of being a good person. The other, i.e. maintaining the imperial and racial state of the world, is based on power. And that's what academics, they are delusional in the sense that they believe that their moral discourse with individuals, other elite individuals, mind you, not the underclass of society, not the people who are in prison and incarcerated, not the people who are at risk for dying at any point, but these middle and upper class individuals that have the opportunity to go to college, that can afford to fly to conferences and eat sushi all day with them. Those are the people that they're trying to convince you should be a good person, as if that middle class, upper bourgeois people who own property and get good paychecks are going to risk any of that in terms of taking up for people that they don't even believe are human or believe are irresponsible, lazy, and criminals, right? White privilege allows you to mask the reality of the world and simply claim on the basis of your moral status, you're saved, you're coming to God / the idea that racism exists, allows you to become a speaker for everyone else that actually suffers under racism. The problem that people have, or that I specifically have with the people like Tim Wise or the Peggy McIntoshes, I don't know them personally, so I'm not trying to take personal shots or ad homs at them. But what I want to point out is something that I think is very important. Whereas black people have to live their lives, especially black men, right? And I push this because death affects black men in a very particular way in this country. When black people have to live their lives in a white supremacist society, their life is the basis of how they have to interact with the world. So death can meet them at any moment. Their life becomes a contingent and expendable factor in how society is going to maintain its order and profit from their being and their existence. White people don't have that. And if you were truly a person that was conscious about how white racism worked, then what you would be, in fact, asking or demanding to happen was that your life be contingent as well. In other words, if a white person understood what white privilege was, they understand that in rejecting white privilege, they are functionally rejecting the ability of them to live their life as a white person in this country as if they are safe or demigods that's protected by a system. And white people don't want to question their own physical life and certainly not their racial existence, because that means that they have to accept that death could come for them at any moment the same way that non-white people have to accept that. And they don't want to question their existence. They're not willing to give up their existence. They'll hold on to their white life just as much as a fiend will hold on to a crack pipe. They are fundamentally addicted to the purity of what they see whiteness to be. And when they talk to black people about what the realities of racism are, they can never understand that type of contingency. They can't understand that death is actually calling for black people at any point, that their life is accidental. So when I hear white people talk about giving up white privilege, I want to hear the white person that says, I'm willing to give up my life. I'm willing to change places. I'm willing to embrace poverty. I'm willing to embrace the same type of social and economic and health demographics that oppressed people put themselves in every day trying to struggle against the system. But that's not what white people are going to do, because they'd much rather get on pulpits and spit moral doctrines about integrationism and discourse theory and democracy than talk about putting their lives at risk for fighting against a system they fundamentally benefit from. And that's why I think white privilege is dishonest, because it allows you to hide behind this coming to God moment, this salvation, redemption, and being recognized by bourgeois black people who in many ways are running from death the same way that every other black person are, but they feel more comfortable if they have a white person speaking for them or speaking with them about their oppression, because they don't want to confront white systems like universities, police states, or governments, or even the chairs of their departments with the reality of what black people face.
I had two quick points on this before move to our next topic, see if Justice has some questions as well. I think what you just laid out, brilliant analysis. I think also with the whole rhetoric around white privilege and these white people who allege to be anti-racist. Number one, even people like Timothy Wise, he admitted to being racist on this program, even though he does not do that consistently when he goes out and talks and gets his thousands of dollars and what have you. But he, on this program, will say that he's racist and anti-racist. Even those sort of contradictions, I think, are very confusing. And I think for a lot of
I don't know what that means, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, and again, but you see, this is that post-structural, postmodern spin on subjectivity that everyone can get into, right? I can live my life in contradiction. And many times we do live our lives in contradictions, right? We see tons of black people in the club, and then we'll see them on church on Sunday, right? We understand the notion of contradiction. However, when you're talking about systems like racism, right, you can't both be racist in the sense that your existence has a material cost to racial groups of people that don't look like you, and then claim that even though that's the overarching dynamic that's supported by economics, the government, and politics, that you're also an anti-racist because you as an individual are doing your good, charity work in trying to fight against racism. That suggests to me that you don't understand the depths and the severity of actual racism, that you think that racism is a discursive or individual phenomenon. And if you understand that it is a structural and systemic phenomenon, then you would look at yourself in the mirror and say, what am I doing? You would be embarrassed to tell the black person that even though I know the cop will shoot you before they shoot me based purely on what I say, that I'm still doing my part and give them a thumbs up. That's a dishonesty, and that's what I mean when I say that it's a bourgeois category. It gets to pretend that discourse and moralization of the right identity politics, i.e. what I advocate or what I say I am, somehow functionally changes the reality of what I am. And, there's just not really an excuse for that.
I think this is all. I think he understands all that. I think all of these white people who participate, I think they understand, they overstand all of this, and they know the impact that their work does, how it confuses non-white people. It's not giving an accurate understanding of the way that racism, white supremacy works, what it means to be a white person. And I think they understand these, I think, are just two huge points that, number one, as I said earlier, non-white people, victims of racism, will not think of these white people as racist. Even if they say, I'm a racist, they will not think of Timothy Wise as racist. Of course, right. They don't think of Peggy McIntosh as racist. They are the savior. They are, oh my gosh, these wonderful white people who get it, and we just need about 5,000 more of them, and we'll solve this problem. I think that's number one. I think also they understand that, and this kind of links to what you were talking about with the importance of black journalists. These people, they go out and they write all these books and give lectures and what have you. They end up being the folks that you go to, the resource, the scholars, the experts on racism. So if you are a black person, a non-white person, and you get serious, you say, hey, I want to start studying, I want to learn, think about, get a systemic, deep understanding of racism, you don't go to Derek Bell. You don't go to Dr. Tommy Carey. You go to Tim Wise. You go to Dr. Peggy McIntosh. So you end up using their framework for how you understand and think about racism. And I think they know you will never solve this problem if we are telling you how to think about what it means to be white, how to think about racism.
Yeah, but again, this is the part, This is why I actually like reading people like Fanon as he's there, right? Because they understood this analysis of the national bourgeoisie, right? People who are going to imitate the culture of the oppressor and pretend that they're friendly with them. So, like I said, nothing against Tim Wise or McIntosh, et cetera. I've read their books, never met them. But the thing is that, look, if you have a Tim Wise giving you the analysis of what racism is, and Tim Wise has never given you any kind of revolutionary conscience. So Tim Wise is not going to say we should rise up and destroy white people or the government. He's not going to say we should have a radical notion of armed self-defense like, Robert F. Williams did. He's not going to embrace the idea that racism is permanent and all white people are culpable for it. He's going to give you a therapeutic answer that even if all white people are racist, and he seems to sometimes believe that all white people are, that you can change them. And then it puts the burden on the non-black person or the non-white person, the black people, to come in and educate white people. So he gets to safeguard his economic position because he's the messenger, and then he gets to put all the black people to work following his message saying, go educate white people, right? And that's the exact opposite of what black people should be doing. I'm constantly arguing with people in my field about this, is that we spend 30 and 40 years educating white people, and what happens? White people who know absolutely nothing about our thoughts, nothing about our authors, nothing about our history, come up and overnight they write one or two articles on a black philosopher, and they become specialists in the area, and people are giving them keynote addresses. All kind of journals are simply publishing their pieces because they're being judged by white people, and since black people are the minority, they have absolutely no say in the peer review process or who does or doesn't get tenure. It's silly, right? White people will generate and utilize anti-racist rhetoric and work for themselves. And the function of that is that it creates a new bourgeois, an academic industrial complex, to quote Andrea Smith, that's going to functionally create an academic bourgeoisie who are now experts and specialists on race, and those people will not be black people. And if they are black people, they're going to be like the Melissa Harris Perrys of the world or the Dysons that are giving you a kind of cultural criticism view of it in terms of how we educate liberal whites. They're not going to talk to poor black people. They're not going to talk to poor white people who poor black people are fighting against for jobs. They're not going to address those class of people because they want to talk to allegedly educated people. And that allegedly educated people are going to be liberal whites who still have more resources, more power, and more visibility than all the black people that they're going to utilize for their own benefit. That's the way the system is set up. So you can look at any of these anti-white racists and look at the systems they've set up for themselves and ask yourself, why are they prolific? Because their work is not original, right? Tim Wise is not saying anything that a T. Thomas Fortune, a Derek Bell, a W.E.B. Du Bois, a Ida B. Wells, he's not giving you any analysis that those people haven't given you. And then the question becomes, well, why is it easier to accept a white face? And we should be asking this question to black people specifically, black bourgeois, that black middle class in the academy. Why is it easier for you to quote and cite a white person that tells you that your job is to educate white people instead of citing black people like the W.E.B. Du Boises of the world, like the Ida B. Wellses of the world, that tell you that your job is to educate your own people? And the reason for that is that nobody pays you any attention if you're a black professor trying to educate black people. Because the reality is the university, just like the rest of the world, doesn't care about black people. They only give you an audience when you're trying to talk to your oppressor. And that's what I think black intellectuals have to disengage. We have to disengage the reward system. We have to disengage that desire to be recognized by white people as the basis of how we study race and racism. There's no other way that we can do that because we're just producing more Tim Wises by doing it the other way, by constantly appealing to white sensibilities.
Context of White Supremacy. We'll see if Justice has some questions. I'll give out the number. Many listeners have questions they would like to ask Dr. Tommy J. Carey. The number is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you have questions. Justice, if you have any questions for Dr. Carey, your line should be open. Please proceed.
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Greetings, Gus and Dr. Carey.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think sharing information about racism, white supremacy is constructive in working against it?
It depends who you're sharing that information with, right? As I was just saying, I think there's an attempt, and I think there's a very real practice of de-radicalizing the types of information that we share, right? So a great example about that is the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. You can share that piece all day, and you can make, whoever say, oh, yeah, racism's like a book bag, and it gives people advantages, and, we have all these types of things that go into it. that does nothing to fundamentally challenge the character of social organization. On the other hand, you could give a piece like Derek Bell's Racial Realism or Du Bois' Soul of White Folk. And I think that when you do that, if you're giving it to the right people or if you're trying to facilitate the conversation, then it can help them recognize that what we're talking about here is a cultural political system of racial delineation, of racial classification. And I think that can be helpful. But like I said, the ultimate thing is what people are going to do on the basis of that information. I mean, giving information in itself means awareness of something new, but what does that awareness bring? Right? If you produce more liberal whites that are just going to have nice conversations and make themselves feel good, that doesn't change anything. Right? We need people who are going to go out in the world and act. So I teach students that are trying to learn this information, they're going to go out and change the way they study populations, or if they're going to law school, change how they're going to practice law. I mean, that's what we have to create, practitioners, right? In the sense that we're just having conversations, I'm not very hopeful of that. And I think that academics and teachers have kind of hung their hats on the idea that if we educate people, things will change. But even that idea from the Warren Court that educating white people makes them better and more tolerant citizens is fundamentally rooted in an agenda that's building up Cold War power, or rather supremacy over the Cold War and the United States imperialism, rather than an actual psychological or social change that they had any idea would or could happen. I hope that answers your question.
It does. In your understanding of white supremacy, can non-white people practice racism?
That's a great question. I was actually talking to my wife about this not too long ago. I think that non-white people cannot be racist towards the superior class. But I do think they can participate and perpetuate racism, and I'll describe what I mean by that. So if you take any oppressed group, be it indigenous group, people, African descended people, etc., there is going to be a notion of hate and disdain against the people who oppress them. I believe that is a natural human reaction. In fact, that is what C.L.R. James said was at the root of the Haitian Revolution instead of these grand ideas of the French Revolution, right? It's the idea that you know in your heart and your soul that you were something before a slave, that you were something before a savage, and you're willing to fight and stake your life on that, right? So that hate of the oppressor class and your rationalizations for that is not racism, because if racism is a structure and a social organization, a system of organizing racial superiors over racial inferiors, then if you're in that racial inferior class, to me it seems natural to hate the people that have put themselves on the top and made themselves administrators and organizers or managers of the society. Now, can that group of people on the bottom, the alleged racial inferiors, practice and carry out white supremacy or carry out aspects of racism? I believe absolutely. I mean, we know from, the birth of black psychology as well as even the stuff, anti-colonial studies by Frantz Fanon, that there's an internalization of the inferiority complex, that black people and other oppressed groups of people will start taking on the worldview of their oppressor. They will start to believe that they are really inferior. They start to believe that white really is beautiful and better and superior. And in that way, they can participate in that type of thing. They can participate in vitiating or debasing other black people. Or you could participate in not wanting to marry a black woman because you believe a white woman is more beautiful. Or a black woman can say that she desires a white man ultimately because he is more powerful and a symbol of masculinity that she wants. All those things still advance a program of racism, but those are based on the oppression and the inculcation and the absorption of white supremacists and racial ideas about black inferiority that make the oppressed group of people act in certain ways that are in line with how the white organizer or the white administrator has set up society. So it's a no question in the sense, can they be a racist, but it's a yes question in terms of how they can and do participate in their own oppression through racism.
Of what you just stated, it sounded like it was anti-blackness.
What do you mean?
Like, well, are you asking like what anti-blackness is, or?
Yeah, you said it sounded like anti-blackness. So, in what context did you mean?
Like, I'm trying to remember of one of the things that you just said.
I mean, it's certainly. I'm saying that oppressed groups of people, so like black people in white suburban society, can certainly internalize aspects of anti-blackness and live that out in their everyday lives, right? Where they believe that other black people, like black men, are criminals, or they believe that other black people, this is what Kanye West was talking about, that we believe that black people are bad with money, or they're going to rob you. We can internalize the stereotypes that a white society gives us about our own people. Right. So I think we can internalize anti-blackness. But if we're asking ourselves, can we be a racist in the same way that white people are racist and have organized a society to make sure that there's certain people who are on the top and bottom, then black people or indigenous people can't be racist.
Okay. Also, in your understanding of white supremacy, how many races are there?
How many races are there?
Yes.
That's a good question. I mean, we have to understand. I mean, that's kind of a tricky question. I'll explain why. We have to understand that race has been constructed. It's a historical invention that white people have used and deployed for their own, for their own purposes. So just as you can say that there are white people and black people and Asians and indigenous people, in no way stops, white Americans, for instance, in creating a new race. Now Muslims are a race. We've racialized Muslims, right? Now they have a certain tone, and then that tone and how they look, their phenotype, we marry to them a certain religion, and only these people become our ideas of that religion. So I think that race is one of those things that is constantly changing, but at the same time we know that there's a historical fixation between a white-black binary, that we know that given slavery that there's going to always be, at least in this historical context, something that's called white and something that's called black. But that doesn't exclude the creation of other races like something like Muslim and marrying Muslim to a racial phenotype and how they look and how they act. So I think that it's one of those things where we know white-black exists. We know that historically there's been, white Asian, white indigenous, terrorism by white people, the settler kind of idea. But I think that there's new ideas and new races being created all the time, and I think that we need to pay attention to how we're classifying and criminalizing terrorism to understand how we've functionally created and operationalized the concept of race in describing religion, which is something that I don't think has been done really in any time in modernity, unless we start talking about like indigenous stuff and colonization back in the 1600s.
You use the terms black feminist in the post you did on racismreview.com.
Yes.
It's called A Black Boy is Dead. What do you mean when you say black feminist?
That's a good question. I think, there's kind of two things here. So I think there's a historiographic issue in terms of how we read black women as feminists, and then I think there's this idea of people who identify as black feminists within the kind of an academic bourgeois context. So when I'm talking about black feminists, usually I'm talking about the academic context of people who classify themselves as black feminists. And usually their ideas are things like men and women are equal, intersectionality is their methodology, the belief in democratic education, recognition to solve problems of sexism, and the kind of contention that sexism, racism, classism are all interlinked. And these people largely draw a lot of their impetus from Michelle Wallace's The Black Macho, followed by Bell Hook's intervention on that and her phallocentric analysis, and then kind of going into a historiographic argument from people like, Barbara Smith and Beverly Guy Shiftal. So when I refer to black feminists, that's usually the genealogy that I'm talking about.
What made you want to write a post on Trayvon Martin?
It was immediately upsetting, to see what happened to Trayvon Martin. I think unlike most academics, I started talking about Trayvon Martin about 6 to 8 months before it actually kind of, came up to this firestorm, So I always talk about black people that I feel have been assassinated and murdered within the context of the police state or even white vigilantism. So it's the same thing I did with Darius Simmons, Jordan Davis, etc. What made me write that post, though, was that I saw a very disturbing trend in terms of how we were rationalizing and coming to understand the verdict of what happened to Trayvon Martin. So as I stated in the post, I was on Facebook, a lot of my colleagues and everyone was reacting to the jury decision, and immediately after this jury decision, I started seeing post after post talking about, well, what if he was a black woman? What if Trayvon Martin had been a female when George Zimmerman met him? This is an example of black men's life having more currency. It matters more than black women's lives. And I really had to take a pause here because I was like, look, these seem to be the same types of criticisms that pop up anytime black men are killed or abused in a very particular and systematic way. So what I wanted to do, my wife and I were going back and forth about this. We were talking about it. I was like, we need to write a response to these types of articles because they all fell along the same line. They were all published on black feminist sites. And, and I was like, look, I think we need to make an intervention because I don't see any other side of the story or any other analysis coming from, black intellectuals about why this is very specific to black men. So I decided to write that post to say, look, this is a problem with how we conceptualize the notion of gender. Greg Thomas writes a wonderful book about this where he says, look, when we look at gender, we make gender synonymous with femininity. So when we look at things like gender studies or women's studies, what we see is not the contradiction or the ignorance of the fact that they're excluding something from gender, but in fact that they're canonizing and institutionalizing gender itself, which is why the primary focus is women. And it's like, and if you look at gender in that light, understanding that it's married to femininity, then this is why they're talking about gender has been excluded, because Trayvon Martin is a male and he doesn't have a gender. But I was like, if you look at Trayvon Martin as a victim, as a black man, and look at the historical violence that has been inflicted on black men, then you have a very different narrative. For example, there were posts saying, well, look, if Trayvon Martin had been a female, she would have probably been raped. And I asked myself, well, why does that become the narrative? Because you heard his friend, Rachel Gentile, say that you need to run away. He could be a rapist. But the idea of another man raping a black boy has no imagination in America. People in society don't see that because all they see is black male death. They don't even think about the sexualized component of black rape or black molestation. It's the same thing that happened up there in Joliet where they killed 2 young black boys to fulfill a necrophilic fantasy. Right? We see these kind of sexualized crimes, but the black male body never gets sexualization or gender married to it, right? So when I wrote that post, what I was trying to do is say, look, here's a very big problem with how you're conceptualizing gender, 2, how gender is playing a role in Trayvon Martin that no one's talking about, especially with him his death being interpreted by several white women, and 3, what's the real agenda here? Why is it that every time black men die, black feminism says, here's our latch, here's our hook. Let's talk about how black women are being devalued next to black men. When in reality, there's a whole lot of people that black lives, even black women's lives, are being devalued next to. Where are all the posts that are attacking black women's lives being devalued next to white men's lives, or black women's lives being devalued next to white women's lives, or black women's lives being erased from these very prominent blog sites that nobody seems to talk about except when it's politically convenient to fit into their ideology? That doesn't happen. And even when you have people like Beverly Gottschalk giving, all these great liberal posts and spotlight posts in the root, nobody says, why is Beverly Gottschalk not talking about death? Right? That never becomes a topic of conversation. So I wrote that post to really expose that not only is there an analytic deficiency or deficit in how we understand gender, there's also political ideology here that locates many popular black feminist concerns from academicians and people who claim to be black feminists purely on the basis of how they're treated next to black men and not how black females themselves are situated in the larger context of a white supremacist society.
What else do you think would have happened if Trayvon Martin was a black girl with the same incident?
Those type of hypotheticals are tough, right? I think that the type of brutality. So if we're assuming that all things are the same, and Trayvon Martin was still killed, right? And it had been a female. I'm not sure that a self-defense case would have held up the same way. Right, I'm not saying that is a easy case where somebody says, "Well, look, George Zimmerman would automatically been convicted," but I don't think that they would have been able to spin the idea that a black female, especially a 17-year-old black girl, was that threatening to George Zimmerman. right? And I think that that's a very important point. Do I think that white men can and do kill young black women? I absolutely think that's the case. I think the question that, again, this is a hypothetical because we don't know, I think the question becomes how do people construct criminality or deviance or danger around a black female body next to a man's, and I don't know if I certainly think that story would be different. I just don't know if it's going to hold up the same way in court. We just don't know. But, I mean, we definitely know that in the case of black men, there's a very vicious and repetitive and programmatic definition of black maleness as being dangerous, criminalized, deviant, rapist, etc. And given that those things happen, we knew what the end of Trayvon Martin would be. I'm not so sure that we know what that end would be in terms of black women.
Do you think when slavery was going on, black females got mistreated less than black males?
I'm sorry, you blanked out a little bit there. Can you say that part again?
Do you think when slavery was going on, black females got mistreated less than black males?
No, I mean, look, slavery was the absolute debasement of African descendant people to the category of non-human, right? I don't think that we can even imagine the horrors of that type of event. So I can't even begin to say what is or is not less or more in that type of situation. What I do think is a problem is, and I've written about this and I've spoken about this before, is when we imagine the brutality of slavery, one, we don't imagine it as a routine thing. We don't imagine the brutality of slavery as part of slavery, right? We think it's just that incident. It's that time they got whipped or it's that time they got raped, whereas slavery is actually the debasement of a black person to a non-human status, which means that violence and rape and brutality was something that was constant to that condition. The other thing that I've also talked about in terms of how we imagine slavery is that we have a very heteronormative view of it. And, you know, I've constantly cited people like Greg Thomas and Thomas Foster and even Archibald Grimke back in the American Negro Academy papers, where they talk about the kind of brutality that black men had next to white women and other white men who were raping them during slavery as well. And I think that one of the ways that we articulate gender based on being female and understanding rape as being a male versus female incident, then what we forget is that there were homosexual or homoerotic tendencies that made black men and boys the objects of desire. They objectified them sexually. And the other thing that I think really gets with people in terms of how they imagine slavery is that people don't see white women as being perpetrators of rape and violence towards slaves. So even though C.L.R. James gives us very rich stories of white women cutting babies out of women's stomachs or hitting women aside their heads and killing them with bats and irons and things like that, we don't really see white women in that way. And then when we have stories and documented narratives of black men being raped during slavery by white women, I think it's very difficult for us to imagine that kind of condition and that situation of powerlessness, because we still look at masculine ideas and masculine identity as incapable of rape. And I think that that's one of the ways that we take away and we distort the history of slavery and the violence during slavery in this country. So, like I said, I don't think that we can talk about degrees of violence, one less or more than the other, but I think that we can talk about how do we understand and expand our imaginations to conceptualize what types of violence happen to all enslaved African descendant people on the basis of being classified as non-human.
What do you mean when you say black manhood referring to your post?
When I say black manhood?
Yes.
When I talk about black manhood, I'm really trying to talk about all the processes of maturation, all the issues of identity, all the socioeconomic conditions, the historical conditions, the cultural conditions that explain the transition from black boys to black men. And right now I'm actually working on a research project called Eschatological Dilemmas, where it looks at the fear of death or the expectation of death as one of the major transitional issues in terms of how black boys understand themselves as black men. One of the things that happens in this country or even in the gender scholarship, mostly in black feminist scholarship, because that's kind of the majority of the literature, is that there's an idea that black men are simply mimetic. And what I mean by that is that they only imitate the ideas of the society around them. So we don't talk about black men or boys as being reflective agents of consciousness. We don't talk about them having a certain consciousness or experience of the world that makes them act or react in certain ways. And what I'm trying to show is that when we study black manhood, that what we're in fact trying to do is understand the relationship between black boys' expectation and aspirations to be a man, and then them also dealing with the realities and the pessimism of understanding that they may die before they become a man, given the structure of a white supremacist society. So what I'm trying to do is contextualize black manhood as a type of phobia, or a type of, or at least influenced by the phobia of death at the hands of the police, death at the hands of the government, or even the idea of social death not being recognized, or having to functionally live the idea of a citizen subject or the citizen slave in America, given that they don't have any ideas of social mobility, property ownership, and are undereducated more than any other group in America. So I'm trying to understand black manhood in terms of the concrete day-to-day conditions that are really trying to confront and present obstacles to black boys becoming black men.
Thank you, Dr. Carey, for coming on the program and answering my questions. Gus, go ahead.
No problem. Thank you.
Let's get some of the folks that dialed in. The person that called in, 8917. Did you have a question for Dr. Carey?
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, hi. I have a two-part question. The first question is, do you believe that blacks are the worst treated out of all the non-white oppressed groups?
You mean historically or contemporaneously?
Contemporarily, yeah.
I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that we're talking, when you say that, we're talking about a group of people who survived slavery, but were not the victims or did not suffer genocide like indigenous people. So given that there's that we can't visibly see Native Indian or indigenous peoples that once ruled and lived freely in America, it's hard to kind of weigh systemic oppression next to genocide, right? That being, and I want to kind of bracket that because I think that's very important. But when we talk about that, black people as a racialized group next to other racialized groups like Asians, Latinos, etc., then I think that their condition is probably the worst out of that group, out of those groups.
Okay. Yeah, I believe that as well. And the second part of my question is, well, basically, I believe it's white supremacy today in today's society emphasizes blacks versus others, and the others including whites and non-whites. And I just wanted to know, in light of this, how should blacks approach or conduct themselves around other non-whites, whom I believe are on the upper end of the totem pole, so to speak?
Yeah, in terms of class mobility, I think you're right? So if you look at, the Latina explosion in population growth, when you look at these demographic aspects... Which
I think was deliberate. Sorry to disturb you.
No, that's fine. I think the question becomes whether or not black people see themselves in coalitions with people who may not have the same stake in the civil rights, or in the fight for civil rights or the overthrow of white supremacy as they do. One of the benefits of being non-black in this case, still non-white but non-black, so Asian, Latino, etc., is that there's a different path to assimilation, right? So you can have Chicanos who are extremely radical and very conscious of the position that Latin American people and Latin descended people have in relationship to white people and the settler/colonizer. But then you could have people who just believe, well, look, I'm an American, right? And I think that the question becomes, how do black people locate themselves next to those people? Because unlike Latinos or Latinas or Asians, black people don't have the same path to assimilation. Like, you can be the black person, you can be the black conservative, but your skin color still marks you as different. And the question in this era, in this kind of post-Obama era, becomes, well, how do people see blackness? Because it's very clear that all the ideas and kind of sympathy that we got in the civil rights movement is pretty much over. So the question becomes for black people, well, how do you cultivate any kind of political relationships or alliances that still are very race conscious, that are still fighting against white supremacy, when people pretty much say, well, look, because Asians have made it, because Latin American people have made it, in many regards, we have all this huge social mobilization from one sector of black women, what's the problem? It really does give post-racialism a different type of face, right? As if the people complaining are just the people who could make it in this kind of tough world. So I think that when we talk about our relationship to other people, or other groups of people, we really have to keep in mind, well, what is it that they're fighting for? If they're going to assimilate into a system that we're fighting for, then I don't think any kind of political relationship or even, shared oppressed consciousness is possible. However, they're still poor, marginalized, et cetera, and they understand the systemic facet of what's going on, then I think there's an opportunity for conversation. But our interests are going to be fundamentally different down the road.
All right, okay. Well, thank you for that. I just believe that non-whites do not like blacks, so that was why I asked the question, because in my experience as a black person, I just had negative experiences generally with other non-whites when I tried to initiate friendships with them. And, initially, seemingly the so-called friendship seems to go well, but then for some reason, it just sours at the end. And my impression has always been they hold these white supremacist views, against blacks.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, look, it's just like I said at the beginning of the program. That's the effect of white supremacy, right? White supremacy is not only the material, right, but it's also kind of the cultural and psychological aspects of how we internalize certain stereotypes about racial others in the society. So, given that context, again, I would say that we have to be careful in terms of how we associate with people who have assimilated white notions of black inferiority. So if we're dealing with a population that says, look, I've made it, you didn't, this is proof that black people are inferior, you kind of know what side of the fence they're on. And again, that's why I'm saying we have to be very careful in how we understand white supremacy. Because on the other side, if you were kicking it with people who identify as Chicano or Chicana, they're going to have a very different racialized system. So they're not necessarily, they possibly still could, but they're not necessarily going to buy into those very same stereotypes, right? Non-black groups are still, varied and different, just like black people are. But I'm saying that in terms of how we interact with them as a group, that test really becomes whether or not they've assimilated and bought into those kind of racialized stereotypes, which in your case seems to be the case, not knowing anything about the person, the nuances of the situation. But, it's certainly likely that, certain groups of people and certain group of non-blacks can buy into white supremacist notions about blacks. That's been historically true from jump.
Okay, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question.
The person that called in, last four digits, 3557, 3557. Your line should be open.
Hello, Gus.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for Dr. Carey.
Yes, sir.
Do you think it's possible to have black sovereignty while white supremacy being the number one control mechanism on the planet? Do you think that's possible?
That's a good question. When you talk about black sovereignty, I'm sorry, go ahead.
By black sovereignty, I mean, the quality of having independent authority over a geographic location.
Right. In the United States, no. Right.
I know, not necessarily United States. I know.
Oh, you just mean like anywhere in the world, or
Africa?
Yeah, I'm always torn about this, right? Because on the one hand, if we accept what black people are and what they've done historically, then of course there can be black sovereignty, because black people have certainly historically ruled themselves before the dawn of colonization, right? So I think theoretically it's possible. I think there was opportunities for it, of course. The problem is that in today's system, right? When you think about Africa, most people still think of Africa as a country. We don't have the notion of it as a continent with different languages, cultures, and peoples, right? So when we think about what self-determination looks like, we don't even have an idea of the people we're talking about, much less all the colonial exploitation that goes into that now. And even if we did have self-determination, so many black people in the United States don't even recognize themselves as a people, right? One of the important aspects of being self-determined is to recognize that you're part of a racial, ethnic, or cultural group. So given that we don't even have that kind of consciousness dictating how we interact with as a group in the United States against white people, much less internationally, I don't know if it's a probabilistic type thing. So theoretically, yes, I think it's possible. I think it's historically been done. In the conditions of global interdependence and, kind of white supremacy and neoliberalism, probably not, because all the materials, land, economics, etc., are dictated by colonial powers like the United States, Europe, Germany, etc. And I mean, even Asia has hands in Africa. So, it becomes very doubtful that we can just declare sovereignty and organize around that racial concept in this day and age, at least in my opinion.
I have another question, and I've been thinking this for a while. I can honestly say that the reason why black people are in the position they're in is white supremacy and also not being able to have unity. I think that we tend to point fingers too much, and we have gotten lazy, and we have lost the ability to think economically.
Right. I certainly think that you're correct in that latter part. I mean, be it Floyd McKisnick or Carter G. Woodson or Booker T. Washington or T. Thomas Fortune, right? I mean, hell, this is Ralph Bunche's point. Hell, there's always been a need for economic self-independence, right? And I think that we've lost that. We've become a consumer culture in every stretch of the imagination. This is why I'm always criticizing black academics, because we made our academic products, our intellectual products and scholarship fundamentally dependent on white recognition to get that paycheck. In other words, we've traded off our intellectual products and aspirations for how white people reward us. So that means that we don't have any kind of ideas coming from the black intellectuals telling us how to sustain populations, how to build up independent economic zones or blocks, neighborhoods, etc., when that should be their primary, one of their primary concerns. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we're certainly lost in that regard. One of the things about integrationism and now this idea of post-racialism is we just want to kind of fit in where we get in. And I think that's a very dangerous idea given our economic and racial position in this country.
Okay. And I want to conclude what the last woman said before she had gotten off got back on mute. Yeah, I feel we are the most hated race on the globe. And, most people don't realize that when immigrants first come to the country that they are brainwashed by white Americans. They are given a perception about black people that we are nothing but criminals, that we kill and everything. And, a lot of people need to realize that when they go into public school, they are taught, white people plan all of their years ahead of time. You know what I'm saying? And so that's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, again, I think that's the difference of understanding a society organized for specific ends versus a society where kind of anything goes. And America's certainly not organized in terms of anything goes. It's a very deliberate program. And a lot of things, and this is something that our media and communication scholars should be producing more of. I actually compliment Jared Ball for his work in this area, understanding the relationship between media and propaganda. I think it's important for us to understand that the idea and the images of negative media that were being shown in the United States are not only being seen and are shown in the United States, they're sent worldwide. So when we talk about stereotypes, when we endorse stereotypes, or we have these political feuds about blackness or Obama, etc., these are not simply disputes that we keep in-house as if they're only geographically located to the United States. These things play a very active role in socializing the rest of the world into anti-black racism. So I think you're correct there.
The person that called, our caller in Alabama, your line should be open.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
The reason I asked, because there's something wrong with my phone. I can hear y'all, but it's kind of clicking on and off. I can hear y'all pretty much. But a question I had, I really had two questions. I'll start with my first one. Do you think reversing the colonization of different lands, say, it should be like the root of counter-racism? Like, because to me it's like, you know, as long as the lands that were took are still colonized by, you know, white supremacists and other people who partake in the colonization process, whether it be willingly or unwillingly, as long as the colonization exists, I don't see the end of white supremacy. Because I think that was the basis of white supremacy, was to take lands that did not belong to them. And that's my first question. My second question, statement would probably be, I kind of agree that we are the most hated race of people, but it's kind of confusing what I'm trying to say. I would say to hate, the reason I believe blacks are hated in America like the most, because that's the fish bowl I'm looking through, the United States. But I think in America it's like that because to be American is to, you know, hate black people. You know what I'm saying? That's like hating black people is American as apple pie. And I think a lot of other races a lot of other ethnic groups from other countries pick up on that, and then they, you know, when in Rome you do as the Romans do. And I mute my line. I just sit and just listen and learn and see. Would you respond to my first question?
Yeah, I think people like Robert A. Williams, you know, a lot of the indigenous scholars have made this point that you can't have a notion of challenging white supremacy and believe that you should still, you know, participate in colonization. I mean, this is one of the problems that I have with people like Anna Julia Cooper, Alexander Ferrell, you know, even Ida B. Wells, as much as I write on her, is that they fundamentally believe, for instance, they should colonize Africa, that, you know, black Americans had the sacred right to go over to Africa. So I think that the same way they had that view, many black Americans fundamentally believe that they're American and just accept as inconsequential the idea that, you know, we are living and participating in a colonial mindset and a colonial occupation project in disregard the indigenous people's struggle in America. I think that it's inexcusable. So to a certain extent, I completely agree with you that, you know, if the day comes that we're truly interested in decolonization and revolution, etc., it becomes a very real issue where black people are going to have to confront, you know, giving the lands back to the people who rightfully own them. Or whose people historically have owned them. In terms of how we fight racism now, I mean, you know, the problem is so huge because we're talking about colonization not in terms of only the physical occupation of land, but also a cultural and cyclical problem. In other words, we're talking about how the colonization of the idea of American exceptionalism and American superiority, and America being a white republic who is exceptional and superior, still occupies the minds of most black Americans, most brown Americans, most Asian Americans, and the rest of the world, right? So it's not only an issue of giving back land, but it's an issue of how do we expose the interconnectedness of militarism, media propaganda, capitalism, university education, and bourgeois aspirations of black academics, right? All of these things become a conversation that while we need to address to talk about colonization, simply giving, you know, land back at this point in this juncture in history doesn't change the functional role of empire. Another part about that too is it's not like the government's just going to hand land back to a bunch of black and indigenous people. So I think that sometimes when we have those conversations, we forget the role of state violence, militaries, and military brutality against black, brown, and indigenous people throughout history. So on the theoretical level, I absolutely agree. On the second part, you know, I think you're right. I think that the disdain and aversion of black folk in Africa is part of America, right? I mean, I think one of the ways America justifies itself and its existence is that it is not the dark continent.
It is not Africa. It is not Asia. It is not South America. Right, so I think that in being the exceptional white superpower and then having the black non-slave like Obama running that republic, that what you get is this idea that you can still hate black people because black people are uncivilized and be part of this kind of new world modernity where it births racial civilization under the pretense of living in and assimilating the values of the white republic. I mean, this is Josiah Royce's project in the 1900s, right? That we don't have to kill or exterminate people like Britain did. We could just assimilate them and control their minds to get them to reproduce Anglo-Saxon ideas to preserve the white republic. So, I mean, I think some of those things have actually come true. And I think that, you know, when we talk about the aversion and antipathy to black people, that's true. I think that that's part of the American identity. On the other hand, I think that it's also the burden of black people to accept that identity and question it in much better ways than we're doing now.
Yeah, I agree with you, and especially about the part like when you were saying like simply giving land back would not end white supremacy, and it's not like they would just hand it over.
Mm-hmm.
I think not only land should be given back, but the wealth that they stole as well. That's like when you commit a crime or if you rob somebody, you even if they get back what you took from them, even when you rob them, you give them back. The police catch you and they get back what you robbed them. Once you go to court, you still will have to pay some restitution.
Right.
So like once if they was, I don't even have that in my mind that they would give it back. It was taken, it will have to be taken back. But the thing is, whether that be a reality or whether it be a pipe dream, I still think it is important to put that on the table.
Oh, absolutely.
So it could still be, just put that out there in the atmosphere. You know what I'm saying? But
no, I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And again, I talk about some of the segments I do on the Red News Review. I mean, this is always my point in terms of how we imagine the racial struggle. We want to imagine the racial struggle somehow starting with civil rights. So we're arguing about what kind of opportunities white people give us. Can we take advantage of the education and economic systems? How are we going to be rewarded? Do we get positions in jobs? Are we getting contracts, et cetera, right? And black women or black feminists come about and they say, well, we want the same thing that every other group has. And we want the same thing that these elite bourgeois black men have. So now you have a class issue where middle class, upper class blacks who've been educated are trying to get the same thing that white people have, and they're using whatever language they can use or whatever moral force or political force they have to make sure that happens. The whole time that is going on, right, the situation of brothers and sisters in Africa, the situations of brothers and sisters in South America, the situation of black people all throughout the Caribbean, the cases of indigenous people, immigrant people, they all fall to the wayside because we're not fighting racism on the basis of white supremacy, colonization, and imperial exploitation. We're fighting racism on the basis of we want to be like white people, so let's break down the segregationist barriers and logics that prevent us from being like white people. And I think those are two very different understandings of what racism and white supremacy are and its actual costs in the world. On one hand, it's a bourgeois idea that says I should have the same thing as an oppressor and I should ultimately be able to participate as an oppressor in the oppression of other non-whites throughout the world. The other one says, no, we're against racism because it's a system that's oppressing non-whites throughout the world, and that's what we're against. Capitalism, political manipulation, militarism, etc. That latter idea is what King and all our great leaders were about. The next idea is just a bunch of bourgeois rhetoric for people trying to get paid. So I think your distinction is very important.
Context of White Supremacy. Folks who have questions, do not wait until the last minute. Give out the number one more time, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564943 pound. Press *6 if you have questions. Got about 30 minutes, see how much I can get in that time. I definitely wanted to touch on, because you wrote a great piece. And again, you can download this material. You can go to academia.edu YouTube.com/Tommy Carey, and you should be able to access a lot of these papers and other essays that Dr. Carey has written, all of it deals with racism and white supremacy. Download them and check it out to get more information. But he has a great post, one of our former guests who has since transitioned, Dr. William R. Jones. He was like in our top 10, like way back in the day. Like I think I hadn't even been on here, but maybe 2 months he was on the program. We talked about one of his great work, Is God a White Racist? I would definitely encourage folks to check out that text and go back in the archives. You can check out that program, should be in iTunes. You wrote a great piece on his work and some of the other things that he did, and I just want to read a little bit because that's phenomenal. You quote a little bit from him, and then you have your own words. You start with the quote from him, or Dr. Jones. He says, "Once we affirm the particularity of philosophy, it becomes clear that blacks dehumanize themselves if they fail to initiate a philosophical statement that faithfully expresses their experience and culture. Blacks say, in effect, that it is not necessary for them to do their own thing because it is unimportant in comparison with the other philosophical schools. Blacks say, in effect, that the existing philosophies have captured the quintessence of truth and any black input is now redundant. This somewhat radical contention actually follows from the role Jones sees blacks playing in qualifying and describing philosophy. Remember, if all philosophy is particular, cultural, ethnic expressions of experience and normative endeavor, to take up the concepts of white philosophy as one's own forces one to think from the historical position and alongside the racial interests of white individuals who have made philosophy a vehicle to justify and or rationalize racial inequalities. Jones argues that black philosophy's antagonistic posture, its pointing to the invalidity of white concepts and techniques to account for the history and normative aspirations of black folk, is part of the rationale of black philosophy as a culturally specific endeavor. Quoting LaRon Bennett, Jones says black philosophy's antagonism can be summarized as it being necessary for us to develop a new frame of reference which transcends the limits of white concepts. It is necessary for us to develop and maintain a total intellectual offensive against the false universality of white concepts. We must say to the white world that there are things in the world that are not dreamt of in your history and your sociology and your philosophy. I thought that was a real important thing. You commenting on Dr. Jones' work. If you can elaborate, because I think that's one of the things, like people looking for concrete, practical things. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the anti-racism dialogue, our leaning on and using white concepts and white worldviews that are invariably just an expression of white supremacist culture.
Exactly. I mean, I think, and I write on this a lot. It's a very historically substantiated viewpoint, but I think that many people in philosophy don't like to encounter history when they actually do philosophy. So I think that one of the problems is that we look at philosophy as a free system of ideas that in many ways transcends the idea of race, that transcends the idea of a person's political or cultural baggage and our heritage. And I think what William Jones understood from the very beginning, because remember he writes this stuff in the 70s, in the late 70s, is that, look, when you create a philosophy, when you create any system of theoretical import, you're going to do so from your own cultural position. So just like Du Bois and Woodson say, you're going to make the things that you create a testament to your own existence in the world. Black people, however, have gotten into a train of thought where they've tried to integrate their being with white conceptual systems. So in my own work, for instance, I call this the dialectical crisis, where we use white concepts to try to study black people and black historical ideas, which they possibly can't understand. So I say one of the primary duties of the black scholar, specifically the black philosopher, is to understand the intellectual history and the ideas generated in that history from the perspective of the conscience of the people that created the ideas. And if you do that from the perspective of white supremacist notions or political theory, right, like liberalism, or even from the perspective of white philosophical systems of thought like pragmatism or feminism, etc., then inevitably you're not studying black people. You're simply trying to what I call epistemically converge or rewrite black ideas into white language so that white people can recognize them. I think Jones was profound in understanding this relationship between philosophy and cultural production. He understood that philosophy is not simply an objective and neutral thing, but is in fact a programmatic articulation and rationalization of white people's existence, their political ideas, and their aspirations next to every other group of people. And he says, look, if we understand oppression as this hierarchical system of superior and inferior, there's no way that you could, as an inferior person, you can assume the ideas of this racial superior without understanding or assimilating some of the ideas of inferiority. So what Jones was trying to communicate to people is that if philosophy is a cultural system of ideas, if you take it on, that means that you try to assimilate into the culture that deems you to be inferior and not worthwhile in the discipline of philosophy itself. And I think that reading of Jones is very needed because I think, I've had the opportunity to meet him on several occasions before he passed. I think that one of the things that people do is they hold on to one work. So, is God a white racist, right? And they define the whole program around that work, and it's a profound work. And I think that it is one of the pivotal productions of black intellectual thought throughout history. So I'm not taking anything away from that. However, I think that one of the things is that when we focus on one thing and make that the only thing the black author can be known for, we overlook some of these smaller details, right? Because, most of Jones's work was on the problem of theodicy and humanocentric theism. So he concentrates on oppression, but he was doing it from the perspective of religion. One of the things that attracted me to the two essays that I write about in Jones's work is that he was actually interested in more of a sociology of knowledge and a structural argument or articulation of philosophy's role in perpetuating anti-black racism and white supremacy. So given the work I did, that's what made me really attracted to those two works, and I wanted to write something that I thought would be new and innovative and contribute to an understanding of Jones that focused on his race theory rather than his liberation theory. And I think that when we look at that kind of product, I think it goes back to exactly what we were talking about at the beginning of the program, that if we're talking about a systemic and structural articulation of white supremacy, then we're going to talk about how that structure, that society is going to produce things like the law, like economics, like philosophy, like religions that still testify or give testament to their alleged notion of racial superiority. So I applaud Jones for that, and as I mentioned in the piece, I think that his articulation and his insight was one of the earliest launch pads within the discipline of philosophy for what I call the dialectical crisis.
Right on. I would encourage folks, check out Dr. William R. Jones. Lots of great work, Legitimacy and Necessity of Black Philosophy, among other works. Definitely check out his work. Again, he's since transitioned since he was a guest on the program. Wanted to get this in as well. We do have some other folks that dialed in. If I heard correctly, you encourage black people, victims of racism, to refrain from citing, quoting white people. I think you even talked about it a bit on the program, and I wanted to ask, is it a contradiction? Because I read in your essay, Racism is White Supremacy, you do quote Dr. Joe Fagan. He is a white person. And you even, one of your essays, you had it published on Racism Review, which is operated by white people, Joe Fagan, Jesse Daniels. Is that a contradiction?
No. One of the caveats I use is that we should only cite white people who read their work through black people. So here's the moral distinction or methodological distinction I make. We should not cite white people as authorities on black people or black philosophy positively. What I mean is, if white people say should as the way that they approach black people, we should not cite them if they're acting or giving a positive program of what they think black people should do. People like that would be like Anderson's work, The Moral Imperative of Integration, some of Tim Wise' work where he's telling black people what they should or shouldn't do. None of that stuff. We should not cite them as authorities. On the other hand, if we have white people that are saying they articulate this through this view, or they're citing and giving credit to black historical figures, or we're using them in connection to a black intellectual tradition that they're a part of, that's absolutely fine in my book. My problem is when white people get credit for authoring ideas that they are not, in fact, the authors of. So with Joe Fagan's work, for instance, like when I quoted him in the Necessary Knowledge thesis, I talk about him articulating a program that was already started from internal colonization, which he got from Du Bois, that he got from Robert Allen, people like that. I put him in connection to certain types of people that he's representing or that he's trying to talk through, because there were white people that were part of these movements. As much as I'm very specific about the limitations of anti-white or anti-racist white people, or whatever term they use for themselves. As much as I'm not on board with that, I'm very much cognizant of the fact that some black people were talking to white people. Like Du Bois' papers were released by Herbert Aptheker. I can't really cite Du Bois' letters without understanding that he gave them and they were collected by Aptheker. So I think there's context to the piece. In my field, however, I do pretty much have a zero tolerance for us citing white people, given that there's so few of us and there's so few white people that do genuinely good work in philosophy on black people, that there's no real reason to cite a white person on black philosophy, given that so few have interacted or really dealt with the primary text. It feels like psychology, sociology, education, that's going to be a little different, right? But that's kind of the way that I've written about it, and that's the way that I've articulated in previous conversations and presentations surrounding the issue.
I got it. Made clear. I do cite Dr. Fagan has been a guest on the program, as has Jesse Daniels. His book, Two-Faced Racism, I think, because we talk frequently, what do white people talk about when there are no white people around? I think that book gives you a great window into what they talk about, because it's just white people journaling and what have you, and you get to see some of the racist jokes that they exchange, and that's what anyone who's confused and doesn't really understand what it means to be a white person, I think that book will give you a great view into what it means. But even with that, he did admit to being a racist on the program, so but
again, that's why I'm saying I think we have to be honest. Joe and I have talked about this before. He's a professor at A&M, so I love Joe's work, and I think his good work in investigating white people, right? But in terms of where black people and white people are going to come down on the side of historical revolution or the question of white existence, that's going to be fundamentally different. Right, like as an academic project, I can support Joe's work because I think it indicts white people, right? But does it create a program that black people can follow? Absolutely not. Does it create a program that black people should follow? Absolutely not. Because the experience of being black and the idea of liberation that African-descended people are going to have may not have people like Joe Fagan or other radical white people involved, because it's a different program that's going to be based on a cultural and political view of their own social existence and self-determination. We have to separate what we think good work is from political/moral questions of racial existence.
Well said. The person dialed in, Black Gnostic, your line should be open. Black Gnostic, did you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I do. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. In my opinion, you can't separate white racism from Western civilization. It's a subset. It's been interwoven so deeply into Western civilization. I don't know if it can be extracted. Do you think that you can extract racism, white supremacy without pulling down all of Western civilization?
No. No. I mean, you can, and the reason, I think anybody who studies the philosophical anthropology of modernity can understand the reason. You go back to Kant, Voltaire. You could even take it to, Aristotelian, politics or ethics. There are certain views of people who are inside, Greeks and people who are non-Greek, which are barbarians. This is translated into modernity in terms of race with Kant and Hegel, in terms of places that can be colonized and people that should, be enslaved. You can't separate this. Again, this is not about taking the bad white people out and putting good black people or good brown people in. The question is, how are we operating with certain systems like capitalism, like liberalism, like individualism, like, this alleged representative republic/democracy that we have, and how that's used to exploit people the world over. Those are the products of Western civilization/modernity, right? This idea that we can rationally control, dictate, and dominate nature and the rest of the world. So unless you're going to talk about destroying that, then you're not really talking about destroying white supremacy. White supremacy is synonymous with the ideas and the products and the machinations of white modernity. And again, in my field, this is what frustrates me so much, because people say, well, we can extend the idea of freedom. But I was like, why would you extend white ideas of freedom that are specifically individualistic, that you have to rewrite to even have a concept of race, when you can do the work to create a political theory from Haiti, that you can work to create a political theory from Dessalines and look at the failure of Louverture in getting white people out of that country. But we don't do the intellectual work to create new theories that try to disassociate the ideas of white supremacy and modernity from the darker underside of how black people and black consciousness actually interact with modernity. So no, you can't just pull these things apart as if the law, the economy, the education, knowledge, or philosophy in its bare bones is good. The whole system's corrupt. We wouldn't even know where to begin, right? We wouldn't even know what parts to separate, because they're so connected that the idea of individualism is fundamentally linked to the notion of property. The idea of a right is fundamentally linked to the notion of an individual. So what part of that can you extricate to say that we should save this part and throw the other part away? Right? It's a dishonest articulation. Now, I've heard people make that argument, but I think it's disingenuous, because nobody can give us the anatomy of an idea. Right? We talk about parts of an idea we like or that resonate with us, but we don't understand the anatomy of an idea in terms of which part is poison and which part is functional. So until we can do that, which I don't think is possible, we have to understand that the philosophical anthropology, the people that created the idea, are fundamentally carried with the idea all the way through.
Okay, my second question is, to quote a white person, Carol Quigley believes that the civilization is not necessarily part of the culture, but eventually the culture or the ideology will seep through when the material culture invades, say, another land. So he believes that China will, you can still have Western civilization with white people being in power. Do you believe that the ideology that white racism, say in the event, that China does assume power in this Western civilization culture that we have, do you think white racism will go along with it? Yeah.
I mean, unless you're talking about destroying, the way we're using Western is, Western is not necessarily synonymous with white, right? Because right. Black people were Western too. They were just victims of modernity, but they were in the West. They're still Occidental in that sense. So, I think we have to make that distinction. But on the other hand, to the larger point, I think even if China does take over the global economy and the world community, as long as Europeans still exist, and as long as the kind of organization of the darker races, I think this is where world system theory makes so much sense. You're still going to have darker races at the periphery. They're still going to be the labor. So I think that the ideas that justify that system, that exploitation within the global economic scheme, is still going to let white supremacy ring true. Remember, white supremacy is that organization of the world, right? So if they're profiting, they just become at the top of that organization. That doesn't say anything about how white supremacy changes. Only about who administers white supremacy changes.
I completely agree with you, and that's all that I have.
Well, thank you for the question, sir.
Before we wrap things up, you wrote a piece, I think one of your more popular recent essays on Mr. Kanye West, victim of racism. Yes. You can't stand the nigger I see, Kanye West's analysis of anti-black death, or a black man's refutation of the bourgeoisization of black cultural criticism. I have one quick question before I get to the essay. We've talked a lot on this program just about remembering the legacy of racism, white supremacy, that it was a law. You could die if you were a black person in various states for learning how to read or attempting to educate yourself. Even we were talking, even you don't have to go that far back. In Danville, Virginia, in the 1960s, black people were attempting to protest. This is before Bloody Sunday. Black people were attempting to protest peacefully, not tearing up anything, just trying to organize to deal with racism, white supremacy. They organized at the library. Whites responded by removing all of the chairs and tables from the library so that they could not come there to organize. So just with this sort of history, it shouldn't be surprising, and everything that's been done with regards to education and not giving black people access to schools, books, etc., that it shouldn't be surprising. But I think there's a pretty massive deficit with regards to black people's reading comprehension. Do you think that a lot of black people would struggle to grasp what it is you're saying and to be able to comprehend everything that you put in your post? Because it seems like the language is a bit elevated.
Oh, you mean the popular posts on Facebook or the
the essays that you can like download from like academia.edu?
Yeah, I think some of that, I think so, because some of that's written for really to kind of confront and take on black bourgeois / white academics. The reason I do so many, radio interviews and, my talking segments, because I think that those are much more accessible, but at the same time, I don't think that they're alienating. I mean, I think when I write about Kanye West, I think people very well understand the concept of the nigger, and that if you are called a nigger, seen as a nigger, death is you're confronted with death constantly, right? So I mean, I think there's always going to be some kind of limitation in just how academics, or even even the religious styles of preachers are alienating to some people, right? I think there's always going to be that kind of deficit and breakdown. But I think amongst black people, I try to write in a way that's accessible, and on the other hand, I try to kind of reinforce what my academic writings say in kind of the spoken word by constantly talking to people and trying to talk about contemporary issues that really affect us, that really don't have much to do with the academic side of things, but that we should actually know about. Our racial consciousness isn't really dependent on whether or not we can understand deconstruction, right? Our racial consciousness is dependent on whether or not we can see black boys like Trayvon Martin and Darius Simmons and the young black baby Ayanna Stanley be shot and no one care or no one shed a tear besides their families, right? That's racial consciousness. That's something that's not taught, but something that's spoken about in terms of how we understand our empathy and our connection to our own communities.
I got it. Okay. This is from the essay. I just read the title on Kanye West. You can't stand the nigger I see. I'm skipping down. This is a little bit closer to the conclusion of the paper. Actually, I want to read this, and then if I can get the clip, because Kanye West has been doing a lot of interviews lately. He's been talking about racism, but at least in the two interviews that I've heard, where he was on the BBC and then most recently last week with Jimmy Kimmel, both times he emphasized it's classism. Even I think with Jimmy Kimmel, he said, we don't do racism anymore, it's classism now. You wrote, this is third to last paragraph, you write, West reproduces the symbolic relationship the black man has to the ogre, the white woman found in Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, in destroying the possessions that symbolize white power and social status above blackness. We must address what the white woman represents. But unlike Cleaver, West is not trapped within a psychological neurosis that both hates and craves the white woman. For West, the sexual assault of the white woman, in both its literal and fictive rendering, addresses her culpability for the rape, the murder, and the dehumanization of the black man, and the impotence of the black community. You're talking about in some of his songs, I think most specifically New Slaves, where he's talking about what white women and that sort of thing. This is on the newer album, Yeezus. I read this and I thought, wow, I've heard a lot of Kanye West music. We've talked about him before, and I know he has made a lot of statements, not just George Bush doesn't like black people. It's in a lot of his songs where he's explicitly talking about racism and the impact that it has on black people. This is something that happens over and over and over again. However, him being with Kim Kardashian, I think she's a white woman. I could be wrong. I think she's someone who's accepted as white. That, and then these two, now he's coming out publicly and saying, hey, it's classism. It's not racism. I think he said specifically, that's why they got upset with Paula Deen. We don't do it like that anymore. Now it's classism. Now it's about money. He's a victim of racism. It just seems, I don't know if he has the clarity that you suggest with what he's doing with his music. Go ahead.
Well, you see, this is what's really interesting. So when he did that interview with the BBC, he actually made this statement, because I'm actually writing a chapter on that BBC interview. He actually made a statement where he said, nowadays we don't only do with racism, but it's like racism's little cousin classism, right? And then when you listen to him give his analysis of what that means, he very much understands himself in relation to, you have a black celebrity and you want to reach out to urban pop culture, so you marry blackness to a product. And I find Kanye West interesting because I think his analysis of racism still holds. Like, I think this is what he's talking about in New Slave, right? Because he says back in the day it was racism and for him he means racism with a segregational logic, right? Like where the fair skin can only drink from a certain fountain, right? But when he talks about new racism in terms of New Slave, I think that he thinks of it as you have racialized groups of people that remain enslaved to the man based on what they can buy and what they desire. So his whole point on there, even when he's comparing George Lucas talking about the new theaters and how he had already built it but got no credit for it, is that he sees blackness as not being able to be the producer and innovator of material products. So it's not like what Kanye West is a revolutionary anti-colonial consciousness. Rather, Kanye West is trying to point out the contradiction of being a rich black man but still not being seen as rich because he's a black man. I think that's why on Jimmy Kimmel you get that kind of articulation of it's classism, because when he's talking to Jimmy Kimmel, what he's trying to tell him is that, look, no matter how rich I am, it's still like I'm an animal in a zoo. And Jimmy Kimmel comes up and says, you're right, like I know what that zoo thing is like. And Kanye kind of makes this face. So I think that he's still very conscious of racism, but for him he's trying to frame racism as classism because he's trying to articulate how even being rich and being a celebrity, as he says, still puts a ceiling on what he could accomplish because of who he is. Now, in terms of the Kim Kardashian thing, I think that's tricky because she's Armenian, right? But she doesn't get to pass as white. But I think that Kanye West is kind of a tragic figure, and a lot of people want to read him as, well, he's crazy, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. But I think Kanye West is more like Floyd McKissick rather than a Franz Fanon. And what I mean by that is that Kanye West fundamentally believes that you can buy nice things and have all the possessions that white society tells you can't have. And in doing that, you point out the contradiction. So when he has that verse about being a black man on the top floor with a white woman and the cops come to see, they want to shoot King Kong, he is talking about how black men possessing things like wealth and like white women actually becomes a mark for death, and this is why he keeps having the interplay with the niggers. So I think that it's not so much that he's not profound. I think that when we think of black people, we kind of put them in one box, right? We think that all black people are revolutionary socialist cats that are trying to break down the system, whereas Kanye West is really like that Black Soul City, Floyd McKissick type character, where he's going to say, I want to possess everything white people have for black people, and he's pointing out the contradiction of what happens when you have all that, and corporations, corporatism, and white supremacy don't let you still be the innovator and still make you the labor and still make you just the medium between the black urban connection and the black youth, or what white people see as hip-hop culture, and your pop drink, right? So I think there's different ways to read Kanye that's still consistent with what he said on BBC and Kimmel, but I think we have to pay attention, because I think that as academics, we try to put Kanye in a box that fits our ideology rather than letting him be the speaker and originator of his own positionality.
I will definitely reiterate, I have heard him say quite a few things that are very lucid in terms of his understanding of racism, where at times it seems like he gets it. But for me, and I would go back to Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, and the passage. I'm not going to read it again just because I've read it so many times on the program, where he talks about, for the black male, where who can make me a white person? I've been downtrodden, I've been abused. Who can give me that acceptance from white civilization but a white woman, the love of a white woman? And in fact, there was an article that came out, it was earlier this past summer, where he was saying he used to draw himself in Kim Kardashian's family. This was after his mom died, and I just thought, wow, what a profound thing to say, like for this black male who grew up in Chicago to be drawing himself in this white family that, you know, maybe I could be down with them, maybe I could be a part of their family. And I feel like for a lot of black people, when I did my review for Kanye West's Yeezus album, I used the book, not Eldridge Cleaver, although that would have been a good one too, but the book, Look Out Whitey, Black Power is Going to Get Your Mama. Because I feel like many black people, we have confused working against racism as, hey, if I can get a white woman, if I can get a white man, I'm working against racism. And I feel like that is the furthest from working against racism you could possibly get.
Look, I'm absolutely agree with. Like I said, I think he's a tragic figure, so I'm not going to defend his shortcomings just because I write on him, right? You know, I'm not that type of scholar, right? I think there's complexity there, right? And I think you're absolutely right. But I mean, this is something that I think Kanye admitted too, because earlier in that piece, I talk about how he thinks that he's a Gil Scott-Heron on the one hand, but also wants nice things, right? So that's what I mean when I say that he's not going to be the type of cat that's going to say, he's not revolutionary conscious in that way. He's not like, I want to break down the system, so I don't want any part of the system. He's like, I'm going to point out contradictions in the system because I'm going to point out what the system won't let me have. Right, and I think that's I think it's a valid view. It's certainly a less revolutionary view. But there's another part of the matrix that we should, explore that I don't think that we usually write about, because when we get black people, we just kind of fixate on them. We fixate them on them in terms of their pure ideas and not their actual human complexities. You know, but no, I mean, I certainly agree with that interpretation, because he does seem to have, he's very materialistic, and he does seem to have this kind of, I don't know if it's desire or obsession with white women, but that's something that he certainly fixated on. And that's what I meant when I said it's kind of Cleaver-like. It's that, he both recognized the danger that white women pose to black men, but he also seems to want a desire for them, right? And that's, I haven't really figured out what that's all about in him, but, he certainly does say things like the Hampton spouse verse that I think is very real, or even the way that he understands that black men sleeping with white women absolutely debases the worth of a white woman. I mean, these things are profound, and it fundamentally challenges some of the feminist conceptualization and historiography of what black male sexuality is. But on the other hand, you're right. I mean, he is with Kim Kardashian, and he doesn't seem to have, even though he makes these things in his song, doesn't seem to have the kind of revolutionary consciousness you would assume would go along with that, right? I mean, even if you look at the Amir Baraka's, Black Dot Anonymous, there's a consciousness that goes along with, rape white women, rape white men, kill their mothers, right? Kanye doesn't have that other part, so, or he at least hasn't articulated it in any of his songs or in public. So, it's a complicated, articulation of what his philosophy and what his psyche actually is.
As is the case with most victims.
Right.
Do you have time for two quick questions from these?
Yeah,
callers?
Absolutely.
Okay. Person that called from a block number, do you have a question for Dr. Carey? Person that called from a block number, you had a hand up. Did you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. May I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Right. Two questions. Dr. Carey, are you from Texas, or are you just in Texas?
No, I'm just in Texas. I was born and raised in Louisiana.
Louisiana. All right, and the next question is, I like this show because it focuses on racism and white supremacy. And since my resources are limited, I have to have a very narrow focus. But I wonder, do you think that's the real problem, or is the problem, like Gus's Cook says, is the problem actually just white people?
So are you asking if the problem is white supremacy, or is the problem just white people?
Right. Is it really more adequately described as a problem of racism, white supremacy, or is the problem more adequately described as the problem is white people?
Wow. It kind of depends on the day of the week you catch me. I think the problem overarchingly is white supremacy, but white supremacy is internalized in making white people, right? Like, if there wasn't any white supremacy, there wouldn't be white people. So I don't think you can really separate the two. And unfortunately, I think that white people in America are so fundamentally committed to their own lives, their own privilege, their own concepts of civilization and achievement, that to make a distinction between those two things at this point is only theoretical. It's only a hypothetical case. Most white people, be they conservative or liberal, Republican, are fundamentally committed to some kind of preservation of the system, be they on the most extreme right side, which says nothing should change, or the most liberal side, where they say things should change, a lot of things should change, but we should go through it through the system, through law, through rational discourse. Both of those things preserve white life, and they preserve the structures in American society that allow white people to thrive. Because even those gradualist systems preserve white life above everyone else that's dying and trying to change the system for the better, for their own, survival. So I think it becomes a complicated problem in the sense of how we practically deal with white people. But at the conceptual or systematic level, I don't see white existence as being fundamentally separate. And that's another way of saying white people is fundamentally separate from the system of white supremacy.
So, but how would you engage in any kind of targeted warfare if you're trying to attack a system? I can't focus on attacking a system, and I don't even think these people with all these guns in Texas are focused on attacking a system. I think if you're going to wage war, it has to be against people.
Well,
so I think the focus has to be on white people, and I think when you make the focus on anything other than people, then you don't have a target.
Right, but you have to understand that even when the white resident or white citizen is killed, that's when systems come in to protect them, right? So, think about what happens when the idea of a white woman is raped. Here at Texas A&M, we get maroon alerts all the time. You automatically have a police force, people patrolling, looking for black people that fit that description. When George Zimmerman was getting convicted for killing a black boy, you had the white society running to defend his, defense fund, right? Those are what I mean by systems. So even if you attack individual white people, I don't know if you mean, violently attack or assault or protest, etc., you're going to get larger systems of government, police, economics, business, etc., coming to aid and protect that social order. So when I say that you have to attack the system, what I'm suggesting is that it has to be a larger idea, right? It can't be, we're just going to take over these white people and act like nothing's going to happen, or I'm going to go shoot this one white person and act like nothing's going to happen. What I'm talking about is at large taking advantage of other states, trying to attack the United States, taking advantage of breaks in white solidarity during economic crises. Those are the types of more global political programs that I'm talking about. Individually attacking white people is just going to get a whole bunch of black people killed if it's not guided by some, deliberate and programmatic way of engaging the white law, the police state, etc. And again, as I want to reiterate, this is not some idle talk about revolution, because I want everyone to keep in mind any kind of disruption of that system brings down the force of the military and the police state to preserve the order of that system. So it's not like you're just going to go and say, I want to next to this person. You're not going to get the police or the military or the government looking at that with a very suspicious eye, especially in the world where they can classify any kind of social disruption as terrorism. That's not the world we live in. Protest is going to be criminalized. So what I'm talking about is both the intellectual conscious raising of that, and then the very deliberate way of us using lawyers, economists, etc., to try to figure out how to confront these larger aspects of domination.
Yes, but I don't know. I still think that if you have a clear target, and if you identify the target and you identify the weaknesses of that target, then it doesn't necessarily have to be modern warfare. It's like if you look at their vulnerabilities. If you look at them like cancer, they're much more susceptible to cancer, something like skin cancer. You've got Australia who thinks that they're okay, and they have skin cancer off the chart because of a hole in the ozone layer. Targeted warfare is just being more, coral CFCs in the atmosphere. Of course, you would decimate the enemy, and you'd also have a lot of collateral loss. But if you focus on who the target is and what you can do, then I think we can get this done. But there will be a great number of casualties. So, or there's a lot of other things. It's like your A&M, they still do a lot of chemical They still do. Right now, what they'd like to do is go back to doing what they did before, and that's decimating a population with disease and then going in and taking over. It wasn't so much the steal as it was the disease take over a lot of the populations in the West. And even right now, we don't have that much bubonic plague left, but I noticed that all of it's on Indian reservations. So there are many infectious diseases that you can target towards them.
Right, but the problem
that would not affect us.
Right,
but I think that people like you should probably talk about focusing on an actual target instead of a system like racism and white supremacy.
Right, and I understand your point. But again, we don't control those doctors, those technologies, those weapon delivery systems. I mean, because a chemical and biological attack on a population, as you said, I mean, that's huge collateral damage. So the question is, do we have the scientists to scientifically engineer diseases and viruses that only attack, one group of people? I mean, we're just. I mean, I can understand that kind of guerrilla tactic. I mean, I know it's been historically thought on by various scholars and authors and activists, but the reality is we don't have the means to do that or control that. I mean,
yes, we do. Yes, we do. I mean, these are simple chemicals, and I was taught very well by my people in Texas. And also, we have all of the labs in South Africa. Even though they've taken the nuclear weapons down, those labs are still very functional.
Okay. Well,
I want to make sure we get the other folks that call in. Thank you for the caller in Texas. The person that dialed in.
Thank you so much for taking my questions. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Caller is 6369. Did you have a question for Dr. Carey?
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Hi, good night. I have a question for Dr. Carey.
Yes.
It seems that every third white woman I run into on the street has 4 or 5 quote-unquote biracial children. And I wondered, what do you think? What are your thoughts on why these children are being created?
Biracial children?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, look, I think the problem, we've always had biracial people. I mean, it's never been a thing where you've had a pure racial stock. I think that's one of the myths of white supremacy. I think the question today is, how do biracial children define themselves, and in what way do they perpetuate certain type of cultural apparatuses? So if you have biracial children that desire to be classified as white because they fundamentally believe in inferiority of black people, or they're fighting against race consciousness, or they just want kind of this global humanism that accepts anybody, I think that becomes more the problem than simply being of 2 different races.
Okay. But I wondered, are they being created on purpose? Like these white females?
That's a good question. I mean, back in the day, Sidney Olivier, he was the Prime Minister of Jamaica. He said one of the best ways to control a racial minority population is to have a bunch of biracial babies and let the biracial children control the racial group. So like I said, there's historical precedent for creating biracial children intentionally to de-radicalize the racial consciousness of, the dominated or the oppressed racial group. Is that the case in the United States? I'm sure you can make the case for it. I don't know if it's true or not. Like I haven't studied, the biracial trends or any of that stuff. But like I said, I mean, it's a theory out there. I know there's historical precedent for it in terms of using biracial children, biracial peoples to control oppressed racialized groups. Is that the case right now? I don't know. And I certainly don't know if they're being produced for that purpose, but I think it's something for someone to study.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Get people there, late calls. This last person, last caller, the person that dialed in, 8235. Thank you for your patience, Dr. Carey. Caller,
no problem.
8235, do you have a question?
Yes. I'm out for last week major, and I was wondering, it seems like, is the design of white supremacy, is the system is basically, the laws itself, the United States, it's set up purposely to benefit, white people and and basically turn the whole, planet into like a plantation or something like this. So is that this is purpose and basically, is that the purpose of basically, like the system and basically, the European, basically, what do you call it? Basically, turn it into basically the whole thing into the world into a prison, basically. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, world systems theory, Oliver Cox, Du Bois, these people understood. I mean, actually, the Caribbean theorists like Eric Williams and C.L.R. James are really good on this. I mean, they're trying to explain how Europe and the West, so including America, are organizing the world in terms of spheres and peripheries where they can exploit the darker races for labor. And when you look at military intervention, I think when you look at who the United States wants to declare war on, when you look at, how we're exchanging, I mean, back in the day when we were trying to demilitarize ASEAN nations, I mean, I think this all fits, right? I think that when we look at white supremacy, we have to keep in mind that we're talking about not just the United States, but how we can use all these different lands and continents for resources. And one of the resources in Africa and South America is labor, is the people. So I think that when we lose sight of that and we start trying to just talk about equality and things like that, we miss how laws and militaries and corporations actually function to exploit and take advantage of those people in those continents. So I don't think that it's far-fetched. I think that's actually the purpose of it. I think this is the conclusion that people like Martin Luther King and W.B. Du Bois came to at the end of their lives. Where I think we've dropped the ball was you saying that you're, a philosophy major. I think we dropped the ball in terms of how we analyze that. So, I mean, you have people like Charles Mills, who wrote The Racial Contract, who wrote a really nice small essay called The White Polity that nobody ever talks about, where he makes that exact same argument. But because philosophy is such a white-dominated and really bourgeois integrationist discipline, many black people don't focus on the structural and systemic articulation of white supremacy and still want to talk about how reason, compassion, etc., can make white people better people. So I think you're on the right track with that interest. But I would urge you to explore Mill's work, Du Bois, and some of the Caribbean authors like Eric Williams and C.L.R. James on that question. But I think that when we lose focus of that, we ultimately do disservice to what King was actually focused on, and we keep trying to, like I said, reinvent the wheel instead of starting with the insights that these black thinkers ended their lives with, and stop talking about moral suasion on white folk. I just think that's a dead end, and that idea doesn't really capture why our militaries and why our economics and our foreign policy are created and directed the way they are. But if you take a white supremacist view and a world systems view, you really do see how imperialism and militarism are still facilitating the imperial project of the United States. I just think that's a more rigorous and historically accurate view of understanding white superiority globally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I had another question before us. Is in a sense to develop an Africanized, consciousness and looking in the world from an African perspective and not looking at it from a European, perspective in a sense, because like I was saying, is in the sense that these philosophies are set up for to look at it from a European lens or something, and African culture is totally, different from European, and a lot of philosophy that, a lot of the Greek philosophers, from what I read, got their stuff from Africa, and Kemet, and basically, and even the concept of Christianity, Islam, and stuff like those concepts are African, and in a sense, and their whole view of things are, I think are different. And I think that, for the black person, I think, I was saying I think we have to Africanize ourselves, because you have to remember, those values, those values, and what's considered, right and wrong, and all this stuff, that is, we call it, that is basically to support the white culture view of things and make everything else seem like it doesn't matter, and it has to operate within a white supremacist outlook or something like that. So anything that goes against that, is considered wrong and like, and destroyed or something like that. And that seemed like, and what I'm saying, like, I think that black folks, we have to look at it from like, our perspective. And I think that like Malcolm X was a point that where he thought through it, and I think Martin Luther King to say, we should love everybody, and we just go to church and pray for everybody and love everybody, and like, but you don't have like a political, line behind it or something like that, a political thing like, Malcolm X or something like that, or from Africanizing yourself and that, getting a colonial or European consciousness or something like that. Right. And I think that, and like, and I was saying that, I don't see no conditions that's really improved. I feel like, the state of black folks in America has just gotten worse. I don't see any, improvements just because you get like a token or, mulatto president and they think, everything is cool. And it seems to me it's just gotten worse. There's no unity, no black unity. It seems like now it's about, we take on the ideology of European individualism and all these other different ideologies of the concepts in the world. So basically, we take on our identity. Yeah? So we take on that identity because they dominate.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. But I think, I agree with what you're saying. But I think one of the things is, one, that's kind of how we bastardize King. Because I think King was very much involved in or interested in how we understand black people, black history, and black contribution to civilization. But I think that's part of the propaganda where we don't read King as a revolutionary anti-colonial and only read him in the terms of his Christian ethos under agape and universal love. The other part about that is that I'm very much in tune with what you're saying in terms of re-Africanizing ourselves, but we have to understand that in the process of re-Africanization, we risk distortion. And that most black people, especially in the West, and specifically in the United States, don't have a very rich concept of Africa, much less of African history that would allow us to correctly and succinctly appropriate the types of cultural traditions and symbols that we need to recreate an African consciousness. I think that when we talk about that, we have to be very honest with ourselves in terms of how Western we are and what the psychological and economic pitfalls are in terms of what we aspire to. And we truly desire African culturalism and African consciousness and a try of anti-colonial African consciousness at that. And what we're talking about is a functional disillusion of the notion of property, dissolving the idea of money, ridding ourselves of the ideology of capitalism. These types of things, redefine ourselves purely on the basis of our relationships in the world. And while I think that's certainly involved with many of our cultural ideas and practices, I don't know if it's the core mainstay of those cultural ideas and practices. So I get what your point is. I certainly think you're correct in terms of diagnosing Eurocentrism and some of the problems in Western democracy, individualism, and liberalism. But I think that in a neo-colonial and neoliberal order, where economics and imperial aspirations and the expectation of living comfortably in an empire and not having to be poor, I think that kind of poisons some of our ideas of reculturation towards an African consciousness or a Pan-African sensibility.
Yeah, you're right. Cause I think like some of them have been like.
Hang on, sir. We want to leave it there. You didn't have any other questions, did you?
No, I didn't. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank you, sir.
Again, our guest, Texas A&M professor Tommy J. Carey. Again, I would encourage folks go and check out some of his great works. You can go to it's tamu.academia.edu/Tommy Carey. I'll put it on my Facebook page. You can download some of his different essays. As I said, they're talking about racism, white supremacy. I think you would find them very interesting, very informative. He has a lot of footnotes, so if you're into research and getting more material where you can read, definitely check it out. The essay that you mentioned, Charles Mills, he's been on the program too. He wrote The Racial Contract. You said the essay that doesn't get referenced as often, The White Polity. Is that the name of it?
Yes. And I think he has an essay by that name, and there's also a chapter in one of his books, Blackness Visible. And I think it's a really good essay that I think when people read Mills, they want to read him specifically in terms of how he interacts with European philosophers. But he has some racial realness to him. It's kind of hidden behind his Marxism. But he has some essays there that really point out the anti-black character of global white supremacy. And I think that it's one of the considerations that we need to pay more attention to that he actually puts out in his work.
Blackness Visible. I will see if I can get my hands on that immediately. Before we let you go, we had one person, they just wrote in, this should be a quick one. They just want to know, are you married to a black female, and are both of your parents black?
Yes, both of my parents are black. My mom is a quarter Native American, and my wife is certainly black.
There you go. Thank you, Bruce.
As are my two beautiful black daughters.
Outstanding. We definitely will be keeping up with your writings and you doing your Talking Tough with Tommy on Thursdays. If you miss the live broadcast, SiriusXM, you can see on YouTube. All the clips are posted there. Mr. Redding, thoroughly enjoyed having you on the program.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. We will definitely be in touch and be keeping up with your work. Just continue what you're doing. Super fantastic scholarship, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Take good care and enjoy the rest of your Monday evening, Dr. Carey.
All right, sir. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
Context of White Supremacy. We should at least have some happy listeners who were hoping that we could have Dr. Carey on the program. We will definitely see if we can get him back. He has a lot of other essay stuff we didn't even get to. We'll do a quick commercial break and see if any of the folks that stayed online, if they have any final comments they want to get in before we wrap things up. Again, we should be back. The next scheduled program is on Thursday. We should have a white man. It will be much earlier than normal because he's in Macedonia, so it'll be either in the morning if you're on the West Coast or in the early afternoon if you're Central or East Coast. But white man admitted psychopath should be informative, but that'll be Thursday, early Thursday. At any rate, we'll do a quick commercial break, and then, as I said, I'll double check with the folks that dialed in and see if they have anything quick they want to get in before we wrap things up. Context of White Supremacy.
RacismDaily.com, your number one source for global news reports on race, racism, and overt actions of white supremacy. From Asia to the Americas, to Europe, to Australia, to Africa, racism is not a thing of the past, it is our current reality. Be informed, be globally informed. You should be the first to know. RacismDaily.com, RacismDaily.com, RacismDaily.com.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity. Using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Do you need a one-stop shop for all of your multimedia needs? Triumphant Multimedia is a skilled team of professionals with a passion for great marketing and chic design. Our specialties include consulting, brand development, copywriting, and creative graphic design that's second to none. We also offer photography, photo retouching, videography, and video editing. At Triumphant Multimedia, our goal is to provide highly effective creative solutions built to suit any individual need or budget. Give us a call at 678-732-8067 or check us out online at trimultimedia.com.
Hi everyone, welcome. This is Justice with the C.O.W.S radio program. If you want to learn about, understand, and counter racism, white supremacy, be sure not to miss a C.O.W.S episode. We keep them jammed, packed with constructive information to sharpen your use of words to help eliminate the system of racism, white supremacy, ASAP. Also, to be able to invest in my counter-racist efforts, co-hosting the C.O.W.S radio program, please visit my blog, justdojustice.blogspot.com.
You're just saying just buckets and buckets of words.
I got an uncle real crazy. My Uncle B, 55 years old, hates white people, married to a white lady. And he sit around going, these crackers ain't shit, except for Susan. And he tried to explain the whole thing to me one day, say, yeah, I got a white wife, I love her, she loved me, that's all that matter. But I tell you this, if the revolution ever come, I'll kill her first. Just to show these crackers I mean business. Motherfucking cracker ass, motherfucking cracker. Shit cracker, motherfucker. What? Hey, hi, honey. Motherfucking cracker, I'll kill my cracker kids too.
Right on. We will be back again Thursday. Next scheduled program anyway, on Thursday, much earlier than normal. If you are on the plantation, just listen. You should be able to dial in if your smartphone, iPhone, just listen quietly and not get in trouble with whites. But to have a white person who is an admitted psychopath, who's written a book about pathology, psychopathology, psychopaths, why they behave the way that they do, even talk about, hey, I just enjoy mistreating people. Just see if I can get over on somebody, just for whatever. Person doesn't even have to have done anything. Like, this is just who I am. This is the way that I get down. Fascinating. He should be with us on Thursday, early Thursday. I think it's 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday morning / afternoon, depending on where you are on the globe. Our folks who listen in who are outside the states, this should be one where it's easier for you to listen in. I think that should be like early evening on Thursday, so feel free. Tune in. Always grand to have white people on, especially white people who are in different parts of the globe. I am going to check Charles Mills. I feel like we mentioned a lot of people who've been guests on the program. Timothy Wise, Peggy McIntosh, Charles Mills, Jesse Daniels, Dr. Joe Fagan. Lots of, I feel like I'm missing some people, some other folks who got mentioned during the course of the dialogue. But the archives are there. I've been adding stuff so you can check iTunes and see. Hopefully we'll have it all complete and in chronological order so that you can access the archives all in one spot. But Charles W. Mills, black male, he's at Northwestern University. We talked about the racial contract, but I definitely want to check out Blackness Visible. He does seem less confused about racism, white supremacy, even though he's someone that I think white people do reference his work pretty regularly. But he does have some pretty solid stuff. His book, The Racial Contract, I think is pretty popular. A lot of folks have read that and checked it out. And anywho, the folks that dialed in, 2 female, I think these are newer callers. Do you all have anything you want to get in before we conclude? The female caller that was in Texas and the caller at 8917. Do you all have anything you want to final comment?
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. I am from Texas, and you have always said that when a non-white person starts talking about racism, they tend to get punished in some way. The system steps up and does some kind of punishment on the job or on the plantation or with the salary, or you lose all kinds of things. And I am just amazed that he is in Texas, especially at Texas A&M University, and he can have a platform like that, and he seems to be doing really well.
I think he's tenured.
Yeah, but tenured or not, I mean, this is Texas. He just seems to be doing. I wish we could ask him if there's been any kind of any repercussions. If, just with him speaking out as he has, I'm just surprised. That really is surprising to me.
I brought up the tenure. I brought up the tenure. That is, I think, accurate observation. I just brought up the tenure point because a lot of the very few black professors get tenured anyway, but much less to be talking blatantly about racism and using the term white supremacy and just talking about it to be tenured in Texas. That is kind of, wow. How'd you do that there, Dr. Carey?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, because they have no problem saying you said the wrong thing, and we're going to be punishing you today. So, I'm like that, and that's pretty much standard operating procedure in Texas. They run a tight ship.
Agreed.
All right, just an observation. Thanks.
You have any other final observation? Call it 3557 and 8917. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
Where can I purchase his book?
I was reading from different essays. I will check back at his. I think he said he was working on a chapter from a particular book right now. But a lot of the stuff that I was reading, these were essays. Let's see. Yeah, I think he just wrote a chapter in a book, Illuminated in Black, where he wrote a chapter, it looks like. I'm not sure if he has a full book out yet. I could be in error, but I know he does have a lot of essays that are free. You can just download those. The address is tamu.academia.edu/Tommy Curry. You should see his picture, and then it should have a listing of the different essays that he's done and book reviews and all that. You can just download. You do have to register on the site, but it's free. You can just, make up a fake name, or if you have a fake email account that you use, so you don't get spammed and stuff. But yeah, he has a lot of his material is right there, and you can just download it for free.
And he live in Texas?
Correct. He's a professor at Texas A&M.
Okay. Texas is a very racist Republican state. It's very racist down here.
I think the female caller just agreed with you.
Yeah.
Assuming everybody is good. Right on. I will go about my business, see if I can get blackness visible. If I find it, I will share, let folks know. I did one comment I did want to get in. I played it it was in the sound clip for the compensatory call-in on Saturday. South Park, last week they did just a big racist joke about the Zimmerman trial, and it was tied to the film World War Z with Brad Pitt about this. This is another zombie film number 5,000,008. And this one, I thought they just made it very blatant because it seemed like a lot of the zombies were dark people. And I just thought it was very clear, the racist message that they were sending out to whites. And I felt like South Park was just amplifying that because it was the same thing. The zombies, they were mostly, if not all, black people, even on South Park. And the racism is just so thick in South Park, like all the way through. But I was trying to think of how, if it was a confused non-white person and they've been watching this, like how would you explain to them, like, this is just reinforcing racism, white supremacy. This is just white people having a grand old time laughing at white terrorism, black children being shot and killed with impunity, and just making this, fodder for jokes so they can and have a grand laugh about this. And they reenact the whole thing. George Zimmerman shoots another child that he thinks is black. It ends up being a white person in blackface. I mean, it's just white terrorism and tacky jokes the whole way through the episode. But that was one thing I was thinking about. And then I also thought, I don't really think with white people, I don't think they have any second thoughts. I don't think it is a source of consternation for them whenever it is a choice between racism and anything. Racism always wins. That's what we're supposed to do. That's the number one priority. Domination, abuse of individuals we say are not white, especially individuals we classify as black. I don't think there's ever a moment where they have a headache, difficulties, where they have to sit down and ponder and make a choice. That's why I say I really appreciate when I can capture those illustrations where white people don't waste any time in throwing profit, making money. That just goes out the window when it's choosing between that and racism. Like in The Warmth of Other Sun, where she talks about white people buying property in California at a loss just so that they can keep black people out. Bing, put that in the bucket. When Jay-Z, when the white company that makes Cristal, when they said, we really don't want these niggers buying our product. There's some other champagnes I'm sure you could buy. We really didn't intend for you all to be buying it. They had been getting all this free advertising for years, putting this in songs and videos. We don't really care about all that money. We just don't want you niggers buying our product. We don't even want our product associated with you niggers. That would be another one. Toss that in the basket. Robert Allen, he was mentioned on the program too. He's been a guest. Robert Allen, in his book, The Port Chicago Mutiny in World War II. They had the black people working in unsafe conditions, loading bombs. There was a massive explosion, huge number of fatalities. It was so expansive, the damage that it destroyed and caused great damage to a great number of properties, white-owned properties. White people, as opposed to accurately compensating everyone, they said, you know what, we are not going to correctly compensate anyone, because if we do justice, we'll have to adequately compensate the black people, and we are just not into doing that. So, in the interest of mistreating these niggers, you white people are not going to get correct compensation either. This was white Congress members. This was not just Hillbilly Joe in Mississippi. This was white Congress members who made this decision and say, no, we're not going to adequately compensate because we have to take care of those niggers, and we just don't do that. That would be another one. Toss that in there. There are lots of these examples, but these, in my view, should be pointed out. For white people, it's no problem. A white woman wrote a whole book explaining. This was years ago. She wrote a whole book about the welfare system, what is called the welfare system in this area of the world, being completely inadequate because white people have no interest in seeing black people get the help that they need. Medical attention. You even hear rumblings of that now, talking about getting the whole thing this weekend with the EBT cards not working. But she wrote her whole book and saying that's why this system, the welfare system that we have here, is inadequate. They do not want black people to have access to constructive resources. And she was saying that is all the result, a deliberate act of racism. So for me, I think that's very important. I think that's how you end up with people making claims that, oh, it's not racism, it's classism, it's just about money. I think we get confused about that. Even Dr. Cambon, he said the money is camouflage. It's not about that at all. White people just find ways of practicing racism and making money off of that. And I think it's a lot of illustrations of that even in The Warmth of Other Suns, where they are selling property and they say, well, some of the white people decide, hey, I am going to sell property to these niggers, but I'm going to do it at an exorbitant rate. They're going to pay 200% increase in what the price for this property is going to be if I'm selling to a black person. If I'm renting, the rent just went up by 6,000%. I'm going to gash them. They said this was done all over, not just in the South, but everywhere. New York, California, Chicago, and they're going to have shoddy facilities. I'm not going to renovate. I'm not going to keep it up. I'm going to practice racism, and I'm going to make a ton of profits. That's generally the way they go. But if they can only do one, I've seen lots of evidence they are going to take racism every time. It's no headache. It's no, we got to sit down and think about this for 5 days. Not at all. It does not take them any time at all. The number one priority is always practice racism, white supremacy at all times, in all places, worldwide. Even quickly before I signed, even Saturday Night Live, which I've been saying for a long time. I know that's not something I watch, but just it'll pop up because I'll see little racist skits. They did a skit making fun of Trayvon Martin when that happened last year too. But they had a skit this weekend. They were making fun of the shutdown, and it was a double whammy. They had a bit from Dr. Baruti's book, The Sex Imperative, where he was talking about all the sexual perversions that whites are into. They had these astronauts in outer space, and they were having problems, but NASA was shut down because of the so-called government shutdown, and so they couldn't get help, these two white astronauts. And their oxygen supply was running down, and the white male, he says, well, since we're running out of oxygen, why don't we do the best thing, which is to make this an erotic asphyxiation, where white people have this thing where you are choking someone while you're having sexual intercourse with them. That's supposed to heighten the experience because you're lacking oxygen. All this craziness, and people have died in this where they've choked them in the act of sexual intercourse and ended up dying. But this was in Saturday Night Live this past weekend, so that was one. And then while they're radioing back to NASA to get help, there is only a black janitor present. So the black janitor picks up the radio and it's like, hey, what's going on? And he's just being stupid and he's got his little mop and everything. And they're just making jokes like, of course, black people, that's what you do. You're custodians for us. We are the thinkers. We are smart. The most that you can do is push a broom, push a mop, clean the toilet, empty the trash. That's what black people do. Trash, toilet. That's what we should be thinking about you all anyway. And they even call him stupid at one point because they're trying to come up with solutions for how they're going to get back. And the black janitor's like, well, I don't have any ideas. It's just be something stupid. And they're like, oh, we need help. What do you think? And he makes his comment, his suggestion or whatever. And they're like, yeah, that was really stupid. You're no help at all. Get out of here, nigger. But that's Saturday Night Live every week, every Saturday. Just more racist humor, tacky and trifling racist jokes. That's all you get under the system of white supremacy. At any rate, as I said, we'll be back on Thursday. White male, we will not be at the normal time. It'll be much earlier than normal. That's because he's in a different part of the world, but should be constructive. I'll be listening into the wisdom of psychopaths in between now and then as well. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Monday evening. Thanks all for tuning in. I will do our quick prayer to wrap things up. Creator, we ask that you monitor, minimize the anti-blackness which has contaminated each and every victim of racism. Help us to be patient with all non-white people, victims of racism, including ourselves. Send us resources, life-saving information, and the will to remain steadfast, dedicated to opposing, ending, permanently neutralizing whites. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Ashe.
Ashe.
Context of White Supremacy. Signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Mm-hmm. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.